Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about tonight's author. S.H. Cooper is a horror and dark fantasy author who has numerous books and collections available now on Amazon. I'm running a couple images in the background so you can take a look at some of their books that currently are available. All That's Fair, Threads of Ash, The Corpse Garden, The Ungodly Duology, and Inheriting Her Ghosts. If you guys like tonight's story or want to pick up some great new horror books or some dark fantasy books for this Halloween season, I strongly suggest you check them out. You can find more of her books in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. Times were different when I was young. Used to be that if the sun was shining, the kids were out, and whatever they got into was between them, their buddies, and their bikes. As long as everybody made it home in one piece without the cops on their tail, there were no questions asked. That October, the one when the rumors started, I was finally old enough to tag along with my big brother when he ventured out with his friends. I knew he didn't really want me there, that he was only letting me go because Mom had told him that he had to, but it didn't matter. I was getting to hang out with Billy and his boys, the coolest guys anywhere ever in my 9-year-old opinion. They were all older than me, 12 and 13, and they swore and had firecrackers, and sometimes one of them would nab a couple smokes off their parents when they weren't looking. Billy wouldn't let me try any of them, but just standing in the circle while the others took drags made me feel like a real bad boy. It was during one of these sessions when we were all huddled behind the Woolworths, trying to look devil-may-care and inconspicuous at the time, that Mac Barden brought up the carnival. "It's out in the woods, off the old highway," he said after a short pull from the cigarette. Smoke curled in thin tendrils from between his lips with every word. "Bullshit," Billy said, and I couldn't help whispering the word immediately after with nervous glee. I'd never said such a grown-up thing before, and glanced around with some hopefulness to see if anyone had noticed. They were all too focused on Mac, though. "No, it's there," he said with a dismissive scoff. "I heard some kids at the arcade talking about it. First they said they heard rumors about it. It's supposed to come around every few years, around Halloween, something like that. But I've got a first-hand account. My cousin's best friend was cutting through the woods to get to the pond last weekend, and he actually saw it. It looked huge. There were rides, it smelled like cotton candy and peanuts. He talked to the guy running it, the barker or whatever, at the entrance. He said it's open all month, free, just for kids. No adults." It was the kind of rumor only bored kids caught in a small-town lull would pay attention to, and we were buying into it. Hook, line, and sinker. An impressed murmur rippled across the group. A whole carnival with no supervision sounded like utopia. "So how come nobody's heard of it then?" Billy, still skeptical, asked, and I quickly changed my expression to match his doubtful one. "'Cause it's a secret, shit for brains," Max said. "It's like only certain people can go to it. You gotta know about it. Otherwise, all the parents would be there too." "So we know about it. Can we go to it?" Kirk Blatz, Billy's best friend and biggest kid in the whole 8th grade, swiped the cigarettes from Mac and eyed him with a raised brow. It was a brat pack kind of expression he'd been trying to perfect for ages, but I still thought it made him look more confused than anything else. "We just gotta find it first," Mac replied. "There's a big carnival in the woods. How hard could it be?" Billy said. Talk of the carnival and how we'd find it went on for the rest of the week, sidelining any Halloween plans that had previously been the priority. Maps were examined, and we hung out at the arcade and mall trying to overhear any more conversations about it from the other kids. We were careful not to let our parents in on the planning. We were taking the no adults rule very seriously. Robert bowed out first. His mom smelled smoke on him when he got home one night and grounded him for the next month. And then Jerry remembered he had a family thing to go to, so when the scheduled morning actually arrived for us to bike out to the woods, only Billy, Mac, Kirk, and me were left. And my place in the group was shaky at best. Noah's not going to be able to keep up, Mac griped. I will, I promised earnestly. I looked to Billy for support. It stung a bit that he didn't immediately jump to my defense. He frowned, obviously weighing his limited options, and finally shrugged. He can ride on my handlebars. Come on, man, Max said. We have more fun without him. Mom said I have to let him come when he wants. That's bull... Max started to complain again, but Kirk punched him soundly in the shoulder. Quit bitching, let's go, he said. I'd never been so grateful for the big lug in all my life. I perched myself on Billy's handlebars with a wide grin and held on tight as we lurched out of our driveway. We rode out of the neighborhood, straight down Main Street, past all the mom-and-pop shops decorated with carved pumpkins and paper cutout skeletons that weren't open yet, and across the wooden footbridge to the old highway. The road was uneven, with deep, wide potholes that the other two made a game of jumping over, while Billy swerved more carefully around them, struggling to keep us upright. He just grumbled at me to shut up. Kirk skid off the pavement first, and swept down the embankment, followed closely by Mac, and then, at a more cautious pace, me and Billy. The bikes had to be abandoned shortly after we crossed into the tree line. There was no good path, and it was quickly decided that we'd be better off hoofing it. I stuck close to Billy as we delved deeper into the woods, equal parts nervous and excited, and while the guys talked about all the treats they were going to eat and the rides they'd go on, I just focused on keeping up, determined to prove Mac wrong. A thin fog hung low between the trees, trapping the damp chill from the night before. We wandered aimlessly, unsure of where exactly we were going, but certain that we were going to take as long as we needed to find it. The morning dragged into early afternoon, and I'd started to lag behind the others. My mouth was dry, my legs were tired from kicking through underbrush and bushes, and my clothes were clinging with sweat despite the autumn cool. It was Mac who was doing all the whining, though. I'm thirsty. My feet hurt. How much further? It was hard not to feel smugly superior to him after all the moaning he'd done about me earlier in the day. At least I could keep my mouth shut about how miserable I was. His long string of complaints earned him some sharp remarks from Billy and Kirk, and the three of them started bickering back and forth until I shouted at them to be quiet. Mac was the first to whirl around, ready to lay into me, but my wide-eyed smile stopped him short. Do you smell that? I asked. They all paused and sniffed the air. One by one, their faces lit up. Cotton candy, Billy said. Where's it coming from? Kirk tilted his head up like he might give a better sense of where the smells were coming from. Like a pack of hunting dogs, we followed those enticing scents through the trees. They were sweet and warm and thick, the kind of smells that only come from one kind of place, a carnival. When we heard the music, distinctly cheerful and tinny, we knew we were going the right way, and we started to walk faster and faster until we were running, all of our previous aches and pains forgotten so close to the promised land. The woods thinned around us until we spilled into a large clearing, directly beneath a banner featuring a painted-on smiling man in a top hat and large blocky letters. Welcome. We'd arrived. Beyond the banner, we could see the tips of rides poking out from over a wooden fence, the tops of brightly colored tents, a large, ghoulish face leading to a haunted house, and there was music and the smells. It was heavenly. There was no other word for it. And waiting to greet us, standing tall atop an overturned bucket, was the same man who'd been on the banner, the barker. He plucked his top hat off of his head and waved us over with it, smiling broadly beneath a thin mustache. "Oh, welcome, welcome to the Harvest Carnival," he said, hopping down to greet each of us with a shake of the hand. "Why, you're the first ones here, lucky you. You'll have the whole place to yourself." We cheered and whooped as the barker told us to follow him to the ticket booth, where he handed us each 5 tickets. "These can be used freely on any ride, on any game, but once they're gone, there's a price to pay," he said with a wag of his long finger. "Ah, man," Mac groaned. "We were told it wouldn't cost a cent." And so it won't, my boy, and so it won't. But you said don't worry yourself about that, just be mindful of your tickets, and go enjoy the carnival. That was good enough for us. The barker ushered us to the gate, and we were off, each of our 5 little blue tickets clutched tight in our fists. It was empty inside, both of workers and of other children, but the lights were on, the music was playing, and the popcorn popping, and for a moment, we were the luckiest kids alive. Kirk ran for the shooting gallery where little wooden ducks with targets on their sides were sitting in front of mounted BB guns. He fed a ticket into a slot on the booth, and the 2 rows of ducks started churning to life, going back and forth while Kirk took aim. He missed his first 2 shots, but the third hit its mark, and the unfortunate duck folded down. A siren went off. The string of lights around the backdrop flashed, and the barker appeared, stepping out from behind the booth to reward Kirk with a lollipop. None of us wondered how he'd gotten back there from the gate without any of us noticing. We went from booth to booth, each taking turns at the ones that interested us. I spent 2 tickets trying my hand at ring toss. Billy knocked over milk bottles. Mac popped balloons with darts. Each of us tried the strength test, and every time the lights flashed and the sirens sounded, the barker would be there with a treat for the victor. The tilt-a-whirl was next, and then we were rushing towards the small Ferris wheel and its half-dozen seats that would lift us just high enough to see over the tents. I can't say if Mac really meant to trip me or if we just collided with one another and I ended up going down, but just before we reached the ride, I found myself flat on my back and seeing stars after smacking my head against the ground. He barely paused to glance down at me, laughed once, and then shoved his ticket into the slot and got into one of the slow-moving buckets after Kirk. Billy shouted a nasty cuss after him and crouched beside me. "You okay?" he asked, probably more worried he'd get in trouble if I was hurt than he was about me. "I think so," I said. I sat up, gingerly touching a hand to the back of my head. I was scowling down at the ground, trying not to cry like a big fat baby, when I heard this terrible creaking. The squeal and the protests of old metal seemed louder still, now that the music had become fainter, more disjointed, like a cassette tape about to tangle. Looking up, I realized right away where the sound was coming from. The Ferris wheel, which had only a moment before been gleaming steel and rotating slowly, was little more than a rusted, still skeleton of its former self, and sitting in 2 of the unmoving and warped buckets were Kirk and Mac, laughing and pointing like they thought they were high overhead instead of still at ground level. The creaking sounded again every time they shifted their weight. Billy was still asking if I was okay, unfazed by any of it. What happened to the ride? I looked to my brother in confusion, and he returned my stare, equally baffled. Huh? The ride, it's all wrong, it's old, it's not moving. I pointed at it, desperate for him to realize that something wasn't right. But when he looked over his shoulder, his expression didn't change. By then, the others were hopping out of the buckets and heading over to us. "What's with him?" Kirk nodded down at me. "He tripped," Billy said. I wasn't even bothered that wasn't what had happened at all. I was too busy looking around at the carnival. There were no lights, no music except that ghostly off-key melody coming from somewhere in the distance. Even the smell had gone, replaced by that of mildew and rotting wood. I leapt to my feet, turning in circles and only growing more upset, more frightened, when I saw the state of things. Tents were dirtied and torn. The rides were run down, unusable. The stalls that had been food and sweets were empty except for dead leaves. The ghoulish face of the haunted house was sagging, one eyelid drooping, its mouth fallen open like a corpse from one of Billy's horror movies. All the brightness and good cheer had been washed away by age and decay, and still the others were walking towards the spinning swings. "This is my last ticket," Mac said. "Mine too." Kirk held up his. "I've got 2 more, Billy gloated. "It doesn't matter. He said we could still do stuff after we use them all," Mac was quick to remind them. I tried to call after them to tell them that the swings they were about to climb onto were just cracked plastic on dangerously groaning chains, but I couldn't find my voice. And they sat on the broken down ride, their hands raised over their heads, hollering and carrying on as if they were swooping around high up in the air. The barker was standing opposite me on the opposite side. And instead of the tall, slender man with the thin mustache from before, he was crooked, hollow, his skin tinged gray beneath his threadbare red coat and collapsed top hat. When he saw me staring, he pressed his pale lips together in a sinister, pleasured grin. I was still screaming when the guys got off the swing a few minutes later. God, what's his issue? Maybe he needs a nap. Kirk laughed at his own joke. Stop being assholes, Billy snapped, and then turned to me and said, What's your deal? I want to go. Something's wrong. I tugged his arm, pleading, and he shot me a look of derision that normally would have turned my stomach. Now I just wanted to get out of there. I got one ticket left. I'm going to use it. Billy, please! While we argued, Mac and Kirk had become distracted by the carousel at the center of the carnival. I remembered seeing it when we first came in. Finely painted creatures, both real and fantasy, threaded with shining brass poles, dancing up and down, invitingly as they circled round and round. Now they were chipped and broken, their colors faded, their poles tarnished, and it was clear their dancing days were long behind them. That didn't stop the pair from bypassing the ticket slot and climbing on their chosen steeds. Mac on a white leopard with only 3 legs, and Kirk on a horse that looked like it had half its head smashed, leaving a jagged, splintery crater on one side where the ear and eye should have been. You sure we don't need a ticket for this? Kirk asked, uncertain, even as he swung his leg over the horse's back. The ride's still going, so who cares? Mac replied dismissively. Hey, Billy, get your ass up here. There's a little pink unicorn with your name on it. My brother flipped him off, but told me to stay put and moved to join them. Billy, I want to go, I whispered again, clutching the back of his shirt. Noah, he said warningly. Please. I continued to hold tight, afraid to be alone, even more afraid of letting my brother go onto that decrepit ride. Get off, man. We're not done yet. He yanked himself away and started towards the carousel, and a surge of panic propelled me forward. I had hit my head, and it made everything change for me. I could only hope the same would be true for Billy. I didn't give myself time to stop and think of what might happen if I was wrong, or the world of pain I'd be in when he was done with me. I just swung my fist as hard as I could at the back of my big brother's head. It connected with a crack, and he stumbled to his knees with a surprised, pained cry. You little shit! He shouted, grabbing his head. He started to push himself up, and I shuffled back a few steps, my eyes going from him to the carousel, where Mac and Kirk seemed to think they were riding in a circle. And then back to him again. He whirled on me, his own fist raised to return my blow. Then he froze, his mouth falling open. What happened? His voice was soft, mystified, afraid. Then I grabbed at his arm again, tugging him towards the exit. You see it now too, right? We gotta go. But the guys... Billy, still in a daze, glanced over his shoulder as Mac called his name again. Hey, where are you two going? He cupped his hands around his mouth and twisted on the leopard, as if the ride were taking him away from us, around to the other side, and he was about to lose sight of us. Mac, Kirk, you gotta get off there. We gotta go now. Billy's voice cracked with agitation, and instead of heeding his words, the other guys laughed at him. Guys! His warning was followed by another crack, but this wasn't from him. It was the sharp wooden snap, then another, and the leopard that Mac was riding was suddenly facing him, its head having rotated completely around. The snarl it released was heard by all of us. Mac shrieked, Kirk swore. We saw that his horse with its half face had done the same as the leopard. They tugged at the safety belts around their waist, shouting for us to help them, and we did We did start running towards them. We wanted to get them off the ride, but the gate at the entryway slammed shut in front of us. Billy grabbed the back of my shirt and hauled me back again. From the carousel, there was another snarl, another snap. And the guys were howling. The creatures, the horse and the leopard, had opened their mouths, revealing row upon row of all too real-looking teeth. And they sank those fangs into Mac and Kirk's forearms. Kirk struggled, yanking and kicking and shouting at the top of his lungs, but even with his size and brute strength, the horse's jaws remained firmly shut. Mac could only scream. There was a long, agonized groan of gears and wood, and slowly, the carousel started to turn. Mac and Kirk yelled for us again, begging us to get them off, and I looked to Billy for guidance. He had gone ghostly pale, his lower lip quivering. When I touched his hand, he jumped. "I'm scared, Billy," I cried. The others rounded the carousel, disappearing from view, but we still heard them screaming. 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 When they reappeared a moment later, their arms had vanished up to their elbows, down the throats of their mouths. The barker was standing between them, smiling, delighted. "Join us, my boys," he said, throwing his bony arms wide. "There's plenty of room for everyone." "Go, go, go, go!" Billy held me by the wrist and was pulling me away. My legs didn't want to work. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the barker, who didn't even try to stop us. "Do come back soon, my boys," he shouted over the piercing, anguished screams of our friends. "We'll be here. We'll be waiting. And we're always hungry. As long as there are children, there will be the Harvest Carnival." Billy half carried me the rest of the way back to the bikes. He didn't look back, he didn't slow. He just kept moving, and he made sure that I was with him every step of the way. When we reached the embankment, he shoved me ahead of him, telling me to go, that he'd be right behind me. I sobbed, and I begged him to stay right next to me, but he had to get his bike. It was an impossibly long climb back to the highway, and every few seconds I had to look back to make sure Billy was still right behind me. Once we reached the top, we scrambled onto the bike, him in the seat, me on the handlebars, and he pedaled as fast and as hard as he could back to town. Mac Barden and Kirk Blatz were never seen again. When the woods were searched, they did find the remnants of a carnival. Nothing but broken-down rides and empty, half-rotted booths and stands. They combed through it with careful precision, going through every structure, but there was no trace of Mac, Kirk, or any Barker. It hasn't been used in decades, we were told. It's abandoned. There's nothing out there. It's more graveyard than carnival. The cops weren't wrong about that. It was a graveyard. For Mac and Kirk and all the other kids who had chased rumors of a secret carnival in the woods. We tried to tell them that it needed to be destroyed, but that never happened. It was too much work, too much red tape. And eventually, the disappearances of our friends were forgotten. And the carnival remained. Not that I really thought removing the items would remove him. The Barker. He was darkness. An infection that came with Halloween. I had felt it even as a child. All we could do was warn as many people to stay away as we could. Things were quiet for a time, peaceful even. But about 15 years later, when a little girl went missing near those woods towards the end of a particularly cold October, Billy and I just looked at each other, and we felt the same sick certainty. It was active again. It was back. Because as long as there are children, there will be a harvest carnival. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I'd often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. Well, to pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild. His head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street, and as I reached the other side, I glanced back. And then stopped, dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing. He was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put a half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me, about a car length away from me. Still smiling his smile. Still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid, but he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go. Until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight, and then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back on a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. "Daddy, I lost my tooth," he lisped a bit as he said it. And as I held my hand out, I saw that his hand had a tooth in it. It was one of the front ones, and I congratulated him on losing it so cleanly. I wondered if he had pulled it out himself, but I put that out of my mind. Brandon didn't even pull his own splinters out, and I really couldn't see him yanking out his own teeth. He was 6 and 1 month, as he liked to say, and this was the first tooth he had lost. He was late in that respect. Many of his friends had already started losing baby teeth, but he was giddy as he brought this one to me. "Now the tooth fairy will come and take it away," he said, skipping off to continue playing. Yeah, I'd forgotten that part. Brandon had become obsessed with the tooth fairy after his friend Nina had lost her tooth. He thought of her as the blue fairy from Pinocchio, and he was very excited that she'd be coming through his window and leaving him money for his teeth. He had asked what she did with all those teeth, where she got all that money, and 1,000 other things. I was a pretty creative person, and I'd come up with all kinds of stories about what she did with them, where she got the money, how she came in without making a sound, and on and on and on and on. I was kind of glad that he had finally lost a tooth, because I was starting to run out of material, and thought if he experienced it, he might lose interest in it. We put it under his pillow that night, and I assured him that it would be gone in the morning, and there would be money there when he got up. Then, of course, I fell asleep waiting for my wife to get home, and woke up to find her sleeping beside me and the sun beginning to peek over the horizon. I went quickly but quietly, and thanked my lucky stars that Brandon was a sound sleeper. He hadn't woken up yet. I took the $1 I was going to put under there out of my pocket, and prepared to make the swap. To my surprise, however, the tooth was already gone. No one had left money, but the tooth had disappeared. I looked around, thinking it had slipped out, but it was just gone. I left the $1 anyway, not wanting him to be disappointed, and went back to my room to get a little more shut-eye before the alarm went off. We never made it to the alarm because Brandon came in waving the $1 and saying the tooth fairy had come. "Look at what the tooth fairy left me. He said it was all for me." I told him that was awesome, but internally I raised an eyebrow. The tooth fairy had always been a woman any other time he talked about her. Maybe I thought Brandon had just had a dream or something last night. He put the money in his piggy bank, and I figured that we could maybe put this behind us. 2 days later, as I put him to bed, I put my hand beneath the pillow and felt something strange. I took my hand out and found another tooth. "What's this?" I asked him. "Oh, I lost another tooth," Brandon said. No excitement, no hope that the tooth fairy would come, just a matter-of-fact tone. I guess that was what I wanted. His obsession with the tooth fairy had ended when he had finally lost a tooth. He'd gone from being absolutely excited to absolutely unfazed, and that stopped me for a moment. Why didn't you tell me you had another loose tooth, buddy? I don't know. Just kind of happened. I put the tooth back under his pillow, telling him to make sure to say something next time. Then I kissed him goodnight, put him to bed. When I went to put money under his pillow a little later, the tooth wasn't there. Instead, there was a coin. I took a look at it, thinking that it was a $50, but realized I was wrong almost at once. At first, I thought that it was one of those weird chocolate coins you sometimes get for Christmas. Turning it, I realized it was just extremely grubby. It was heavy, like it was made out of brass or copper, and the surface looked dirty like it had been at the bottom of a well for quite some time. I started to take it with me. Something in me wanted to keep it away from my son, but I put it back instead. It wasn't mine, after all, and by the look of it, it was probably something that he treasured. It had been back under his pillow for less than a few seconds before a hand went searching for it. His fingers took hold of it almost immediately as he clutched it, and I decided to take the dollar back with me. Brandon changed a bit after that night, but it's only in retrospect that I see it. He became very secretive, not my little buddy like he used to be. Brandon didn't want to play video games in the living room with me anymore. He didn't want to read stories at bedtime anymore. He spent a lot of time in his room, and he just seemed to be closing off. His mother laughed at me when I told her I was feeling a little hurt by it. "He's just being a kid," she said. "Kids go through phases sometimes. Don't take it so personally. In a couple of months, he'll be back to his usual self again." I hope she was right, but it was hard to ignore the physical changes that were going on as well. Not only was Brandon quieter, but it seemed like he had grown. He had gained a foot in a single week. Sometimes it seemed his fingers were abnormally long. His arms were strangely jointed, his face oddly stretched. He would look at me sometimes, look at me like he was thinking about doing something that he knew would make me angry. I didn't like it, but he never did it right out in the open. Like I said, Brandon never came to sit with me or play video games, but I'd sometimes catch him peeking at me from the hallway or from under the table in the kitchen. It was creepy, but I figured it was just little kid behavior. A month after Brandon lost his first tooth, I found another one in his backpack. Not just one, I found 5 hidden in the front pocket of his backpack after he left it on the kitchen table when he went to the bathroom. He'd become pretty protective of the backpack, putting it in his room and keeping it close to him at all times, and I started getting suspicious of what might be in there. I didn't think it was drugs or something. He was 6, but I thought it might be something weird or dangerous. What if he had a snake or something in there? So when he suddenly ran off to go to the bathroom, I knew this was my chance to have a look. I needed to sign his folder for school anyway, so I took out the folder and looked over the day's report before taking a peek in the pockets. The teeth were just sitting there, bumping together when I poked at them, but they didn't really look like human teeth. These looked more like animal teeth. And they were too strange to have come out of my son's mouth. They might have been from a cat or a dog. I suppose maybe... "What are you doing?" I zipped the backpack and turned around, looking like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. "Nothing, just signing your folder." Brandon looked at me with a great deal of distrust, taking the backpack and going to his room without putting his back to me. I told his mother about the teeth, and she came home from work, but she brushed it off again, saying that little kids often collect strange things. "My brother collected animal skeletons that they found out in the woods," she said dismissively, and she got ready for bed. "Thank goodness it's just teeth, not a whole skull." I let it go, but it was hard not to see what was going on. Brandon started looking like he wasn't sleeping well. He had huge bags under his eyes, and he was fidgety any time that he was made to sit still, like at dinner or for homework. He'd get short and agitated, muttering to himself in a way I couldn't understand. I listened carefully once when we were doing math homework, and it sounded like he was talking in a different language. He looked up when he saw me noticing squinting at me with that look of distrust, and it broke my heart to see him like that. Brandon had always been my little buddy, and this sudden change in him was painful to watch. 2 weeks later, I got a call from school. They needed to speak to me about something important. Brandon had been in a fight where he had knocked more than a few of the kids' teeth out. I came down right away, afraid that Brandon was hurt, but when I saw him sitting in the principal's office, he looked none the worse for wear. He had a bruise on his cheek, and his hands looked like he had beaten them against the wall, but he didn't seem injured or in any distress at all. Quite the contrary, Brandon looked happier than I had ever seen him. I took a seat next to him in the office, waiting to see what they had thought was so important. We called you in not because Brandon had been in a fight, but because the other rumors going around about him in class. Rumors? I asked. Yes, sir. The students have fought with Brandon and have been making strange deals with other students. I shook my head, not quite understanding. What kind of deals? They say he's been buying people's teeth. I shuddered thinking about the teeth in the bag that I saw not so long ago. I looked down at Brandon, questioning him with my eyes as to whether or not this was true. He looked back at me without hesitation, pretty much letting me know that it was. He's been trading his lunch for him. He's been trading other things for him too, like toys, other small things. He was allegedly trading over 20 students for their teeth across 3 grades. Today, the students in question had taken the trade but refused to give him any teeth. Your son responded by beating the teeth out of his mouth. I looked back at Brandon, asking what he was thinking. He didn't bother to answer, just clenched his fist in his lap and looked to the floor. I think that was when it really hit me how much he had changed. The bags under his eyes were dark and deep, and his fingers were long enough that I couldn't see how anyone didn't notice. Each finger seemed twice as long as it should be. And as he clenched, I could see a 4th knuckle on each of them. The reason we called you in, sir, is to get those teeth back. I turned and looked at the principal. What do you mean? He looked a little green as he wiped his forehead with a napkin. We believe your son has the missing teeth, but he won't tell us where they are, and he won't give them back to us. We can't seem to find them, and the mother is hopeful that the dentist can put them back in if they're not too badly damaged. If nothing else, they want them back so they can take them to the dentist and make sure the teeth are baby teeth, not permanent. Brandon hasn't said a word about where he put them, and we're deeply troubled by this behavior. I looked at Brandon and asked him where the teeth were. He shook his head, not saying a word. I asked him again, and when he shook his head this time, I heard something. Something nearly indistinguishable, but altogether unsettling. Something was rattling in his mouth. Look, we can sit here until you decide to give us those teeth, but you're not leaving until we get them back. I don't know what's gotten into you, but the idea that we wouldn't be leaving seemed to decide him. He bent slowly over the principal's desk, making eye contact with the older man the whole time as he opened his mouth. 3 teeth fell out as he pushed his tongue out. None of them appeared to be his. The teeth clattered onto the desk like old dice, and more than one of them had the root hanging from them. As he sat back up, I had the sneaking suspicion that he was holding out. The principal, however, seemed more than okay with what he had gotten back. He told us to go, saying that Brandon was suspended for 2 weeks, and I collected up my son as we headed for the door. The principal managed not to vomit before we got out of his office, but it was a near thing. We talked the entire way home. Well, I talked, and Brandon just sat there and said nothing. I told him I didn't know what all this was about, but that he needed to stop. This wasn't him. This wasn't like him, and he needed to tell me what was going on so that I could help. I was his dad. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't help him if he didn't talk to me. The whole time he just sat there and stared at me. Most kids who were being chastised looked out the window or looked to their feet, but he stared directly at me in bizarre defiance. His fingers kept flexing, and I saw him put a hand to his pocket more than once. I wanted to tell him to turn them out, give me the tooth from that kid that he had kept, but something in me didn't dare. I was loath to admit it, but I was a little bit afraid of my son at that moment. He looked nothing like the boy that I had known for almost 7 years. My grandma used to tell stories about babies taken by fairies and the changelings that they left behind. This reminded me of those stories. This kid in front of me was so fundamentally different from the one I knew that it was almost like I was talking to a different person. As we pulled up in the yard, I told him that he was grounded. No tablet, no TV, no dessert. Brandon didn't seem to care. He just walked inside and went to his room. His tablet was still on the charger and his TV remote had been left on the door to his room. I didn't know what he was doing in there, but it clearly wasn't playing. He was being too quiet. And when his mother called to tell me that she was doing a double, I almost cried. I didn't want to be here alone with him more than I had to be. And that made me feel even worse. He didn't come out for dinner, and when I went to bring him his plate a little later, I heard muffled voices as he spoke to someone. I tried to get the teeth, but they caught me. I didn't know who he was talking to. Kind of thought that he might be talking to himself, but when a gruff voice responded, I felt my stomach drop. You'll just have to do better next time. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deep and watery, like something from the bottom of a well, and it spoke in a way that made its mouth sound strangely full. It was devoid of any kind of kindness or charity, the sounds you sometimes hear when people speak to children. It was an authoritarian voice, a teacher, and they were not pleased with my son. I'm grounded. They suspended me from school. I'm not going to be able to get you any teeth for at least 2 weeks. Your father has teeth, it said matter-of-factly. Your mother has teeth, too. When he answered, he didn't sound afraid. When he answered, it was so cold and assured. They won't just give them to me. They don't understand what I'm doing. What was he doing? That's what I wanted to know. I gripped the doorknob, hoping they wouldn't hear me, and that was when the voice said something that made my blood run cold. Then don't ask them. Take them, like you did from the boy today. I opened the door in one fluid motion, and my son looked up guilty as I walked into his room. Who are you talking to? I asked. No one, he said much too quickly. I heard someone, I said. I heard someone in here talking to you, and I wanted to know who it was and where they went. That was a lie. I didn't think I wanted to know who they were. What I wanted was for them to never come back again. The person had sounded like some kind of demonic fairy from a kid's story, and I was afraid of what I would see if he did come back. Nothing, Brandon said, much too quickly again. I was doing voices. I talked to him for a little while longer, but I got nothing. He wouldn't talk to me, he wouldn't tell me anything, and eventually I just left. I should have left it at that. I should have just left it alone, but I had to try one more time. He was late, about 10:30, which was pretty late for us, and I decided a peace offering. I felt pretty certain that he was still awake. I had heard something moving around in there, and so I cut some of the pie that I had made to go with dinner and walked to his room. I was going to offer him the pie and see if maybe we could talk. I just wanted to know what it was that made him change so much. Most of all, I wanted my son back. It killed me to have him act like this, but as the door came open, I got more answers than I had bargained for. It was standing over his bed with its long arm going under his pillow, and in the darkness of his room I realized it had to be what he'd been talking to. The pie fell to the ground, but I had a death grip on the plate, and I realized I'd sprained my thumb once I was in any state to feel it. I didn't speak. I could barely breathe, and as the thing turned to look at me, I realized my fairy theory might not be too far off. It was grubby looking, like something that had been living in a ditch. Its features were completely covered in something dark that had the texture of earth, except for the two large lamp-like eyes that protruded from its face like bubble lights. It was tall, something I realized as it took its full height. It had been crouching before, putting something under my son's pillow, and it had to stoop so as not to bang its head on the ceiling, which is above 9 feet from the floor. From its back, 4 insect-like wings protruded. They weren't large enough to carry it, but they were large enough to be noticeable. Its hands and arms, the fingers multi-jointed, were far from delicate-looking as it wiggled them carelessly. I expected it to charge me. I expected it to attack me, but instead, it raised one huge finger to its face. It made a shh sound. "You'll wake the baby," it whispered, and its mouth sounded like it was trying to swallow something. And then it smiled, and I saw not a double but a triple row of teeth inside its mouth. There's no order to them. Molars next to canines, next to bicuspids, next to what appeared to be fangs and shark teeth. Its mouth is such a mishmash of teeth that it's impossible not to feel a little woozy when you looked at it. It pulled its lips down, somehow containing all of those teeth, and before my very eyes, it vanished. My son was pretty upset when I grabbed him up and carried him out of the house. I put him in the car and we waited till his mother got off work before taking him to a nearby hotel. I told her what I'd seen as best I could, and I think she believes there might be something going on now. My son is furious, saying he needs to get back home so that he can do his job, but he won't say what it is. I mean, honestly, I think he's been collecting teeth for whatever that thing is. When I went back to get us some clothes and check the house, I looked under his pillow and found another of those strange coins. There was a box under his bed, and inside is equal parts teeth and coins. There's about 20 of them, and they're sitting next to teeth of every shape and every size. Most of them are animal teeth, but some of them are definitely human teeth. I've taken the entire box with me, but the phone call I got from my wife before I left the house was what really worried me. She called to tell me that our son had locked himself in the bathroom, and she was afraid he was hurting himself. There was a weird squelching sound, followed by him yelling and crying. He had locked himself in the bathroom, but I went and got the manager to unlock it for us, and what we found there will still stay with me for a very, very long time. We're at the hospital now. My wife is in the ER room with him while I sit in the waiting room and wait for updates. The protocol states only one parent can go in at a time, and my son doesn't want me to go in there. He can't speak very well, but he made that very clear to my wife. I gave him space, not wanting to exacerbate his condition any more than I had to. I've got the box on my lap as I sit out here, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. Inside are the 8 teeth he managed to pull out of his own head before we got him restrained. Whatever this creature is, it must get its due, and my son was apparently intent on giving it that due. Probably end up having to take him to a mental facility, but I know he isn't crazy. I saw that thing too, and I know it'll find him no matter where we take him, so be careful when you tell your kids about the Tooth Fairy. What comes to collect their teeth might be something far worse than even you can imagine. Everybody knows that if you surf the web long enough, you'll see some pretty sick shit. This is especially true if you intentionally dive into the dark underbelly of the internet. I've seen quite a few things I don't care to admit to. But one thing I've always remembered is a site called normalpornfornormalpeople.com. The first strange thing about that site was that I didn't find it by actually looking for it. It was emailed to me by someone I didn't know. The email was as follows. Hi there, found this site very nice, thought you might like normalpornfornormalpeople.com. Pass it on for the good of mankind. Pretty standard issue chain letter, although the URL and the last remark really piqued my curiosity. I was having a very boring day when I got this, so I made sure my antivirus was working, and I clicked on it. It was a very average, very generic-looking site. It gave the impression that the creator just barely gave a shit about making it look professional. The author seemed to have a very tenuous grasp on English, and on the front page was a long, boring, and incoherent rant that I don't remember or have saved. The site had a strange tagline, which even today people haven't figured out the meaning of, which was Normal Porn for Normal People, a website dedicated to the eradication of abnormal sexuality. And from the sound of that, I wasn't sure whether I was here to watch porn or if I stumbled upon some kind of eugenics program, but I was here now. I was very, very curious to see what normal people got their rocks off to. So I scrolled down through the rant and nothing. The page didn't seem to link to anywhere else, and I was about to leave when I noticed that every word of the rant was its own hyperlink. I clicked one of them and was sent to a white page with a very long list of links in the form of normalpornfornormalpeople.com/random letters. So I stopped for a moment and asked myself if I really wanted to waste God knows how much time clicking random links that would likely give me a virus. I figured I'd try it for maybe 5 minutes. Just see if anything came up. I clicked one of the links and was sent to another page. This page apparently had totally different URLs than the last one. I was just about to say, fuck this, when I clicked the third link and a video download came up. It was called peanut.avi. A 30-minute video of a man, a woman, and a dog in a kitchen. The woman made a peanut butter sandwich and the man set it down for the dog to eat. This was all that happened for 30 minutes. It was obvious that the cameraman had to stop filming and wait until the dog was ready to eat again, and the dog seemed rather sick by the end of it. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. The hell does that have to do with porn? And I have no clue. I've seen a little over 24 videos from this site, and the majority have no sexual act at all. After watching peanut.avi, I went on a certain image board I frequent to play online show and tell like I always do with weird shit like this, but someone had already made a thread about it. A guy who'd received the same chain letter I did. The image board thread had lots of people with nothing better to do than dig through the site, and that's how I saw the other videos. Most of those 24 videos were very uneventful, and consisted of people talking to the camera in a room with nothing in it, maybe a desk, few chairs. I mean, literally, like nothing on the walls or in terms of furniture. The whole room had a very cold, sterile feel to it. The conversations were idle banter about previous jobs or embarrassing childhood memories. I kept expecting some kind of discussion about what the people were filming or what the site was about, but of course, nothing. You would never know these videos had anything to do with porn if you saw it out of context. I'll say one thing though, the people who appeared in these videos were quite attractive. However, the other videos that actually did feature content I suppose could be called sexual is where things got weird. I'll give brief descriptions of the stranger videos. If you're really eaten up with curiosity, you could try to hunt them down on some kind of torrent site or something. LickedClean.avi. A 10-minute video by a hidden camera in which we see a repairman working on a washing machine for the first 2 minutes. When it's fixed, the repairman talks to the owner briefly and then leaves. The owner checks to make sure the repairman is gone, then begins to lick all over the top of the washing machine. This goes on for 7 minutes. Jumbo.avi. a 5-minute video of an obese mime performing his act. It was actually pretty funny, particularly one part where he pretends to pull up a chair, then pretends that it breaks because of his weight. And in the last 30 seconds of the video, the camera cuts to static briefly and cuts back to the man sobbing quietly, still wearing a mime outfit and makeup. Some kind of obscure fetish, maybe? Diana.avi. It's a 4-minute video in which the cameraman talks to a woman in a room different from those interview rooms. This room looks like one you'd find in a normal person's house. Exactly where they are is never really specified, as Diana only talks about her violin playing. She obviously plays her violin, but keeps getting distracted by something. I didn't notice this until someone in the image board pointed it out, but if you look at the mirror in the background, you could see a fat man in a chicken mask masturbating. Jessica.avi. Another 4-minute cameraman video. This time he's outside a house, talking to another young woman. They talk about canoe rides. The camera zooms out to reveal the city streets behind them occasionally. The strange thing is that no one so far has been able to identify where this street is. I mean, guesses have ranged everywhere from Europe to Australia to the Philippines, but there's yet to be a match for the street shown in the video. Tonguetied.avi. This is a 10-minute video. The first 5 minutes consist of an elderly woman making out with a mannequin. The video cuts out like it did in Jimbo.avi halfway through, and the scene is then a group of mannequins huddled together in a circle around the camera. The lights have been dimmed, and the elderly woman is nowhere to be seen. And from this point on, there's no sound. Stumps.avi. 5-minute long video where a man with no legs is attempting to breakdance on a DDR mat in what looks like the kitchen from Peanut.avi, but much dirtier. There's a radio playing music unseen in the background, but it stops at the 4-minute mark when the man collapses on the mat in exhaustion. He breathes heavily and pleads with someone off camera to let him rest. This off-screen person becomes terrifyingly enraged and yells at him to keep dancing, which he does. You can hear this off-screen person beginning to scream as the video ends abruptly. Privacy.avi. The woman from Diana.avi is masturbating on a mattress in the interview room, while the man from Stumps.avi walks around on his hands wearing some kind of goblin mask. The door in this room was always closed in other videos, but now it's open. And in this video, the only light is in the room, and the hallway's dark. Near the end of the video, you can see an animal quickly run through the hallway. And finally, the last video was uncovered. This one is called Useless.avi. In this 18-minute video, a blonde woman from the previous interview video is tied down to a mattress in an interview room. She attempts to scream, but her mouth is taped over. After 7 minutes, a man in a black suit and a mask opens the door, but he does not enter. He holds the door open for the animal that was running in the hall in the previous video. It's revealed to be an adult chimpanzee, its hair shaved and its entire body painted red. When the chimp enters the room, the masked man closes the door behind it. The chimpanzee sniffs the air for a moment, I think it might have been blind, and notices the woman tied to the mattress. It goes into a frenzy and begins to maul her. The assault goes on for a grueling 7 minutes, until the woman finally dies. The chimp eats flesh from her corpse for about 4 minutes as the video ends. Thread exploded with activity after this video was uncovered. People discussed it long into the night. When I came back to the image board the next day, I found that it had been deleted. I tried to start another one, and they banned me. I tried emailing the guy who sent me the chain letter with the site URL. I sent him like 5 messages. Never got a response. I tried to discuss the website on various places, and I've been banned frequently. The site itself has also been deleted after 3 days after that useless.avi was uncovered, likely because somebody contacted the authorities about it. The only proof that normal porn for normalpeople.com ever existed was a few screen caps people took, and videos from the site that people saved and uploaded on torrents. The most popular which is that useless.avi, which found its way onto a few gore sites as well. Wherever you upload them to, all the videos from normalpornfornormalpeople.com, they get deleted after a while. Everyone has tales about the strange and bizarre. My story is about how my half-whole mask saved my life, and continues to save my life to this very day. Late in December, I was traveling north from California to my home state of Oregon. Nothing fancy. I was just going to visit the family for the holidays. On my way north, I hit a small snowstorm. Nothing awful, just a lot of snow falling all at once. I wasn't worried about the small increase of snow at first, considering I had snow tires installed before I started my long journey home. I did, however, get a little hesitant to drive when the snow started to really come down. The large amount of falling snow, coupled with the large amount already littering the ground as I traveled higher into the mountains, caused me to consider finding a place to stay for the night. I figured I could get some sleep while the storm passed over. That, and the fact that I could give my car's heater a break before it would decide to burst into flames, or worse, just stop working altogether. I scanned as much of the landscape as I could, but there were no buildings in the immediate area. The only other option that I had for my predicament was to keep driving and hope there was a town or exit nearby that I could take in order to escape from the storm. I must have been driving for at least an hour before I saw a sign up ahead indicating how far the closest city was. My heart sank a little when I read 162 miles as it flew by my windshield and vanished into the snowy night. At this point, the snow was beating against my windshield, and I knew that I wasn't going to last 162 minutes, let alone 162 miles. The digital clock on my radio read 1:21 a.m., and I decided that the next turnoff I saw I would take, and hope that I could find a neighborhood that would produce some results on my current endeavor. My thought process was either freeze to death in my car or stay the night at some random person's house. Weighing the two options in my head, I picked the only thing a sane person would pick, and go with the house. Another 30 minutes flew by, and still no luck finding a place to pull off. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I saw a turnoff in the distance. A small shape started to make its way closer into my headlights, and on further inspection it was revealed to me that they were two wooden poles that possibly belonged to a fence. When I turned onto the road between the two wooden poles, the ground beneath me felt rocky and rough, like I was traveling on gravel. I didn't drive for too long before I started to see a small cabin creep into my field of view. The lights in the cabin were off, but the place seemed to be in good shape. I parked my car under a tall, wild-looking tree that took residence on the cabin's front lawn. Getting out of my car, I immediately grabbed my extra jacket and put it on, pulling the half-whole mask I wore around my neck up and over my ears to keep the heat around my face. I put my cap on and trudged up to the cabin. As I traveled through the cold, windy night up to it, what I felt was my salvation. I immediately regretted not getting any gloves for my hands. Despite the irritation I had with my hands, my face and the rest of my body were comfortably warm, so I didn't have much room to complain. I stuffed my frozen hands deep into my pockets and continued my journey across the cabin's lawn. As I made my way to the door, I noticed something odd. There was no indication of life anywhere. There wasn't even a car in the front yard. Taking my right hand out of my pocket, I knocked 3 times, waiting patiently before saying, "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm sorry to bother you so late at night, but I need a place to stay for a few hours." Nothing answered my plea for help. So I knocked 3 more times on the door, hitting my knuckles harder against the aged wood of the entrance. "Hello?" I said again, a little louder, before continuing with, I'm not here to rob you or anything. I just need a place to stay for the rest of the night. I promise I'll be gone by sunrise." As I finished my sentence, I touched the ornate metal door handle, noticing the door seemed to be unlocked. I said in a loud voice. I'm coming in now. If is anybody in there, let me know, please. I pressed the metal lever down, finding it a bit odd that the door was unlocked, and opened the door with little resistance on the other end, closing it behind me with about the same resistance, despite the fact the door looked really old. Looking around the area, I noticed the cabin had 5 rooms. The living room, which was the biggest room, a small kitchen, an even smaller washroom, and what I assumed were 2 small bedrooms in the back. No lights were on inside the cozy cabin, making it almost pitch dark if my eyes weren't already adjusted to the darkness from outside. I decided the best thing to do would be to search for a light switch, so I took out my phone and turned on my flashlight app to scan the walls. My scan produced no results, however, and at the risk of losing my precious battery power on my phone, I decided my best option would be to turn off the light and put my phone on airplane mode. Before turning off the light, I studied the paintings hanging on the walls that I glossed over in the initial scan. Each painting that crossed my sight was just typical landscapes or harbors, things like that. There was a painting that looked like a fox hunt or something like that, but other than that, it was just typical paintings you'd see hanging on the walls around an elderly person's home. There was one that caught my eye. The painting was small and consisted of what looked like 2 adults, a mother and father, a teenage girl, and a small child. The family captured in that painting were wearing what looked like Victorian-era clothing. I'm guessing about the clothes. I mean, they could have been from the 1800s or the early 20th century. Point is that the clothing looked ornate, regal. There was something really disturbing about the image in the painting, though. The faces of each member of the family looked like they were smoothed over with clay. It's kind of hard to describe it. But the 3 family members looked like they had no facial features. And by no facial features, I mean instead of the normal facial features you and I have, the 3 people in the painting had grooves of smooth flesh where normally you have an eye, a nose, or a mouth. The only person in the painting that didn't possess a blank face was the teenage girl, which had normal facial features for a teenage girl. In fact, she was quite breathtaking. I pulled myself away from the painting to take a glance at my phone for the time. My phone indicated that it had passed 2 o'clock in the morning, so I decided to go to the back room and check to see if it was occupied. To my relief, the room was vacant beside a medium-sized bed, ornate dresser, and nightstand. There wasn't much to go by. The walls were blank, beside more sappy paintings to give it a little more atmosphere. Although there was no indication of a heating system besides a chimney, the rooms were bearable enough that I figured I could just bundle up in my clothes under the covers in order to stay warm. I was only going to be here for a few hours anyway, so there wasn't much point to starting a fire, and plus the people who owned the cabin wouldn't be back tonight considering how late it was. I hopped into the worn-out bed, facing the open door, next to another door that I assumed was the closet, and pulled my half-whole mask completely up and over my face to make sure my head would stay nice and warm the rest of the stay. Pulling the fabric of my mask down slightly to set the alarm on my phone for 4:30 a.m., and putting it back down onto the nightstand, I covered my face again and bundled up tightly with the sheets, closing my eyes and letting dreamland take me away until I woke up after what felt like minutes later to the sound of scratching. My body froze as I heard the noise over and over again, softly coming from the closet door. I tried to relax myself by thinking that all the noise that I was hearing was just a rat or some other animal that was spending the night in the closet while the cabin's owners were away. Quietly, I shifted onto my back, pulling my half-whole mask down slightly, so a little slit appeared, giving me a small window to look out. And what was out there? I laid on the bed, stiff as a board, with my cap and mask covering my face in such a way that it acted like a visor, giving me a small peek at what was in the darkness. Thankfully, my eyes adjusted to the dark, which gave me a small amount of reassurance as I continued looking in the direction the scratching noise was coming from. The scratching continued louder and louder for what seemed like minutes, until just like that, it suddenly stopped. Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't a safe kind of silence. The deafening silence in the room was a foreboding, ominous sort of silence. The vacuum of sound in the air was the type of silence that happens in a movie just before something jumps out at you. Just when I began to calm myself down, the doorknob to the closet began to jiggle and turn very slowly. My heart was racing out of my chest as I saw and heard the knob turn, and every inch of my body wanted to bolt out of that bed and out of that cabin before whatever was on the other side of that door got out after me. I laid perfectly still on the bed despite the fact that I had a cocktail of adrenaline, nerves, and instincts telling me to get the hell out of there. My eyes widened as the door to the closet opened slightly, and I saw what looked like a dried head attached to an elongated neck pop out of the opening, followed by a skeletal body. The thing that was emerging from the closet crawled on all fours out of the doorway and slowly made its way to the bed I was sleeping in. I've never been more frightened in my whole entire life as the thing stood up, almost touching the roof of the cabin, and looked down in my direction. The creature stood there, studying me as I peeked through the thin slit in my mask. Pure terror swirling around in my mind as I glanced up at the body of the creature. Looking at the creature's skeletal face, I noticed that it had no eyes in its eye sockets, which led me to believe it couldn't see me even though I could see it. Just when the idea of it not being able to see me started to give me a little comfort, the creature began to speak. "Strange," the creature whispered softly, as it continued to watch me and then began to speak again. "It has no fear of me," the creature continued to say in a hoarse tone as it began to breathe loudly, continuing to look at me and gripping down on the edge of my bed. Feeling the creature's bony hand touch the edge of my bed caused my brain to go into complete panic mode. The only thing that stopped me from jumping up was the thought that maybe the creature believed I was dead or asleep and wouldn't attack. "How can it not fear me?" the thing said through clenched teeth before loudly gasping and suddenly pulling back with its mouth open in an expression that seemed like fear. "It has no face," the thing whispered to itself as it continued to back away. "It has no face," the creature said again, but this time louder than before and slightly more threatening. "It has no face!" the creature shouted as it backed off further away from the bed. I heard the thing breathing loudly and quickly before calming down and slowly returning to the side of the bed. Leaning over to me slowly, the creature continued to look at me before softly beginning to breathe on my face. I could smell its foul breath, even through my mask. The smell was so powerful that it took all my strength not to gag as a reflex to the awful stench. In my mind, I made the choice to keep motionless and not do or say anything that could compromise whatever illusion I was giving the thing that was currently studying me. The creature breathed on me again softly. The stench I smelled from its breath could only be described as pure death, which only strengthened my resolve to stay perfectly motionless. "Strange," the thing whispered at me again, leaning in close to me to the point where I could see and smell its decaying flesh. The creature slowly reached for me, its hand slowly moving towards my face. With every inch that decaying hand moved, I couldn't help but feel my situation becoming more and more dire. I thought that this was it for me. The creature would kill me tonight, would take me away and torture me, then kill me, and no one would know what happened to me. No one would find my body out here. No one would know my story. I could feel tears starting to swell up in my eyes, and I thought of everyone I ever loved being yanked away from me in that one moment. "No face. No face. No face," the creature softly chanted, as its hands crept closer to my face. I could hear the anguish in the creature's voice as it continued chanting over and over as it reached for me. As the creature's long, bony hand crept only centimeters away from my face, I braced myself for the worst, making the last thoughts I would ever have about the people who I loved. Just as I thought my life was all over, a sudden loud noise erupted from the room, filling the ear closest to the nightstand with a flood of beeps, and causing the creature to scream and jump back. As the noise continued, the creature threw itself back against the wall, shrieking uncontrollably in terror as it stumbled back towards the closet. I was dumbstruck for a second before the thought came to me, and I remembered that I set my alarm for 4:30 a.m., which must have been the source of the noise. I jumped out of the bed, grabbed my phone, and pointing the lit-up screen at the monster as the alarm continued to ring loudly. The loud ringing caused the monster to shriek even more in confusion and terror as it retreated quicker as I approached. Seeing my chance, I activated my phone's flashlight and put it on strobe in order to disorient the monster further. "No face! No face! No face!" the creature shrieked at me as it withdrew to the safety of the closet. I continued to shine my light on the creature. And for added effect, I started playing loud music as I continued to jab my phone in the monster's direction like a lion tamer. The thing threw itself into the dark recesses of the closet, and I shoved the door back, locking it after I slammed it closed. The shrieks from the monster got fainter and fainter, like it was retreating deeper into the house. "No face! No face! It has no face!" I could hear the creature yell out as it got further and further away. After hearing the last retreating words of the thing that terrified me, the whole night I bolted from the cabin at breakneck speed, jumping into my car and flooring it off the gravel road. I was shaking all over as I drove, and when I pulled my half-whole mask further down my exposed skin, it was as white as the snow that littered the ground. I was so frightened by the whole experience. As soon as I pulled into the first town I saw, I parked my car and began to sob uncontrollably for a while. The experience that I had just been through would scar me for life. But as I wept in my car in the parking lot of 7-Eleven, I couldn't help but start to laugh a little in between my fits of crying. I got through my whole ordeal without so much as a scratch on me. Aside from my mental scars, I was fine. I was alive. I didn't have to worry anymore. After I finished my whole episode of crying and laughing like an insane person, I entered the store, sniffing and wiping away the rest of my tears. As I continued into the store, the cashier looked up at me and traced my direction with his eyes before continuing on with what he was doing. The store was mostly empty, besides an elderly couple. I was the only customer in there. "A rough night," the cashier said with one eyebrow cocked up as he scanned my items. "You have no idea," I said, looking out the window at the sunny winter day. "Notice you look a bit upset when you came in. What happened? You get dumped or something?" he said, looking up at me as the register computed how much I owed him. Looking at the young man behind the register, he seemed like he was a little younger than I was, although it doesn't say much because even though I'm 22, I look younger than my actual age. I looked at the cashier's name tag for a second before feeling that I had nothing to lose by telling him about the night I just had. The small name on his ID tag read Evan. And as I finished telling him my frightening tale, something odd happened. I expected him to bust out laughing or say I was the best liar he'd ever talked to. Instead of doing any of that, Evan just stood there, his skin milk white as he stared at me with an expression so horrified he gave me the impression that he just witnessed someone get run over by a train or something. "Evan, are you all right?" I said, looking into his eyes. We both stood there quiet. What? Oh, yeah, it's just... Evan began to say before his thoughts trailed off due to the new feeling that we were both being watched. I began to feel eyes burn into the back of my head before turning around to see the old couple I glanced at when I entered the store beforehand. The old couple possessed the same horrified look that Evan had just a few seconds ago. He must have heard the whole story I told. After a few moments of silence, the old couple asked me what I knew about the cabin, to which I couldn't really say. I gave them the best description I could about what I saw. The couple proceeded to tell me about the cabin, about how long it had been there, and that it was haunted by a presence so terrifying, the place was condemned and left to rot away after so many people disappeared. They told me that no one who ever stayed in that cabin has ever been seen alive again, if they've ever been seen at all. One of my best friends stayed the night in that cabin, Evan said quietly as he stared off into the distance, but continued his thoughts with, I refused to go into the cabin. I knew something bad would happen if we went. I tried so hard to convince him that dare was stupid not to go in, but he refused to be labeled as a chicken and continued with the dare. Evan's eyes began to water as he continued with his story. I never saw him again after that. I kept calling his phone, but his parents still couldn't find him. Put out flyers and billboards, and never had any luck. After a few days, we contacted the police. I told them about the cabin. Evan began to choke down tears as he clenched his fists. We found him in the basement of that cabin, sprawled out on the floor, his eyes surgically removed from his sockets, his nose was removed, his lips sliced off. And when they found him, he was naked with an incision from the bottom of his ribcage to his pelvis down the middle of his body. All the internal organs were extracted from his body, and to add insult to injury, his genitals were sliced clean off. But you want to know the worst of it? When the police did an autopsy, they found that he was alive during the whole process. Evan winced as he remembered the whole gruesome sight and said, I never found who or what did it. There's no DNA evidence to convict anybody. They didn't find the tools that made the incision. They didn't find anything. Evan clenched his fist tighter on the table before the old man, listening to our conversation, put his hand on Evan's shoulder to reassure him that it was going to be all right. He comforted Evan and looked at me and said, people have disappeared from that area for decades. Maybe even centuries for all we know. But the bodies are always end up the same gruesome way. I don't care who you are, no one deserves something like that to happen to them. You should just torch the evil place to the ground. The old lady joined her husband's side and looked at me with the most foreboding face I had ever seen. If your story's true, you should consider yourself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. In all my years of living, you were the only one to go into that cabin and come out alive, the woman said, gripping onto her husband's hand tightly as she spoke to me. After hearing the old woman's words, I realized that Evan said the body of his friend was found in the basement, which explains why the monster's voice got fainter. It would have pulled me into the basement if my phone hadn't gone off. I quickly paid for my items and left the store, more troubled now than I was when I entered. Feeling drowsy due to the lack of sleep and constant adrenaline rush caused by my whole terrible ordeal, I decided to go to a hotel and spend the day sleeping and relaxing to get my mind off things. That night, I sat on the bed in my hotel room and looked at the two items that saved my life. In one hand, I gripped onto my half-whole mask, which hid my face from that terrible monster. In my other hand, I held my cell phone, which scared away the horrible beast that could have killed me. I decided that from that day on, I would always wear my half-whole mask to bed. Save my life. That's the least I can do for it. The recent brush with death I just experienced had taught me that life is too precious to waste, so I decided to ask my best friend Samantha out on a date. Things worked out perfectly. Samantha and I were together for 2 years before I recently asked her hand in marriage, which she said yes. Part of me will never forget that awful night. And because of it, not only have I been wearing my half-whole mask to bed every night since then, I've also made it a priority not to live in any type of house that has a basement. And as an added safety measure, I started locking every door before going to bed. It's a pain, but you can never be too careful. Despite these crazy precautions, Samantha's accepted my little quirks and has continued to be supportive as we continue our journey through life together. Couldn't be happier with the way things turned out in my life, and I'm so lucky to be with Samantha. Everything's perfect. There's just one thing that bothers me, and I think I might just have to blame my imagination, but sometimes when I wake up at night, when it's really quiet, sometimes I'll hear soft scratching noises. And I think it's just paranoia, but I swear, sometimes I hear something whisper from inside my closet. No faith. No faith. It has no faith. I planned a Halloween party for Saturday night. I've always loved October. It's a shame I don't drink or like pumpkin-flavored things, and recently I've sworn to get more into the spirit of the season. I got some of the best bad horror movies, decorations from the dollar store, and some of those pumpkin sugar cookies. I invited all of my friends for a casual night to get into the Halloween spirit. No one showed up, which is understandable. We're all adults with busy lives and all. I could eat 10 boxes of cookies without getting sick of them. I did feel a little hurt when I saw a post of a handful of friends dressed up at a bar. I said they could drink, but I wouldn't. I shook it off, telling myself I didn't care. I was going to be the guy watching horror movies alone the weekend before Halloween. I didn't do a totally lame thing like buying pumpkins to carve and a fleece frog onesie as a costume. I mean, I'm an adult, like my friends who went to the bar to party. I may have been a little bit bitter, I guess. This small get-together was also meant to be a sort of housewarming. You know, I finally got to the point in my life where I could afford rent and food, and I got a small townhouse, loving that I no longer had roommates neglecting their chores or clogging the toilet. The fact I could afford all this was a miracle. I wonder if my friends thought that I was showing off a little. I almost didn't feel like it, but I put on a movie after sunset. Watching a bad slasher wasn't the same without friends. I tossed on 13 Ghosts because I remembered that scared me the last time I watched it. Turns out I was a big baby back then. Some of the short horror videos on YouTube were more frightening than any of the movies I'd picked out for the night. I considered going to bed early, calling the entire thing a bust, Then someone showed up. I heard something out in the backyard. Animals often got through the gate to go through my trash, just small things like raccoons or possums. I started to put my food scraps out for them in a dish so that they wouldn't rip apart my trash. I know I shouldn't feed wild animals. They're going to get to the food either way. It just saves me from cleaning up a torn bag in the morning. I like taking photos of the nighttime visitors, too. They normally showed up later in the evening, causing me to wonder just what was in the yard. The glare of the light on the glass door kept me from seeing much. I opened the door a crack to peek outside. The sounds I assumed to be an animal got louder. I strained to hear. It was as if someone was whispering. Was it the neighbors in their yard? I didn't see a soul outside. The mental image of someone peeking over the fence made the back of my neck prickle. Something fell off the counter in the kitchen. I'm man enough to admit I screamed like a girl. My heart thudded hard against my chest. I thought someone had broken in, and not that a box of cereal had fallen off the counter. I turned my back to open the door to look across the room to see what had fallen. My first floor was just an open space, so I could see the kitchen area from where I stood by the back door. I confirmed it was just a box falling over, then closed the door. Oddly enough, the whispering stopped. All right, no more scary movies for me that night. Okay, one more. But Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island is a Halloween classic, not a movie that could add to my unnerved mental state. I'm also man enough to admit I kept all the lights on that night. I didn't care about an increased electric bill. I wouldn't like a shadow person to get me while I walked up the stairs in the dark, thank you very much. This is a normal and reasonable precaution. As I watched a childhood classic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. All right, I needed a snack. Something to take my mind off things. I wisely invested in a chest freezer. It was cheaper to buy in bulk and freeze things later after all. It wasn't smart keeping your chest freezer in the unfinished part of your basement for when you wanted ice cream. I stood at the top of the stairs, my mind playing tricks on me. I flipped on the light before I even looked down into the basement, fearing seeing the darkness staring back. I hadn't put much down there. The side of the basement from the top of the stairs really looked like an abyss with the lights off. An intrusive thought came to mind. That if I turned the light off to stare down, something would stare back up at me. I scoffed at such a stupid idea. To prove myself wrong, I flicked off the light. Surely, I was alone. No one else here, not at all. A set of red eyes pierced through the abyss, landing on my own. Nope, no. I flicked the light back on, my heart racing. I mentally cursed myself, hating the fact that one horror movie got me seeing things. To again prove myself wrong, I turned the light off. Do you know those movies that kill off a character at the start, to set the tone? I would have been one of those characters. Even the eyes in the dark seemed disappointed in my stupidity. I was moving the moment they were. I heard a cackling laughter and heavy footsteps racing up the stairs. The front door was so close by, I felt something tear through the back of my costume. I didn't have time to get out. The 2 seconds unlocking the door meant my death. Instead, I ducked inside the small bathroom right beside my freedom. I slammed the door on a set of long, dark fingers. I screamed trying to get the door fully closed. By sheer luck, the intruder pulled their fingers away so I could lock the door. Whatever was on the other side banged against the wood, laughing in a raspy voice that made my skin crawl. The doorknob wiggled. I tightened my hands around it, praying that it would hold. Finally, the noise died down. The thing was still out there. I was trapped, no cell phone, no food. Not even a window to crawl through. I knew whatever monster I now faced could break down the door. It was just playing with me. Why don't you end this quickly? You don't want to starve to death in there, do you? The thing whispered on the other side of the door. I'd die of thirst first, I corrected. Well, there was a sink in here. I would starve to death. No wonder that monster cornered me so easily. I studied my ripped frog suit. Could it be fixed? This thing cost a lot of money, after all. Why are you even here? No one ever said the place was haunted, I asked. I hoped that the longer I spoke with the monster, the less frightening it would become. Exposure therapy and all that. Oh, I think you're well aware of your past sins. This kind of pain was coming to you one way or another. The doorknob wiggled, making a chill go down my back. Nope, this thing would be scary no matter how long I heard it speak. But what sins is it talking about? I scanned my brain, desperately trying to think of anything it was referring to. Sure, I did give a coworker a little bit of a mean nickname, but never to his face. It was only after he was a dick to me for an entire year, and after he made such a huge mess, we needed to stay for overtime for a week to clean up. I also only tipped the DoorDash driver $9 in my last order instead of $13. Okay, what else? If you admit to what you've done, I'll be gentle when I eat your heart out while you're still alive, the voice whispered. I don't think that's possible, but thank you for the offer, I said, voice shaking a little. A small sound came from behind the door. It was a mixture of a snort and an annoyed hiss. Okay, what else have I done? Said I was going to donate to the local shelter, but I haven't gotten to it yet? Was this because I didn't have change for the man by the bus? Did I not tell a cashier to have a good day? I'm not a perfect person. I'll never say that, but I've never gone out of my way to hurt someone. If I somehow did, I'll do my best to make it up to them. Maybe my easygoing personality made me a bit of a doormat, huh? What a way to figure out your own friends don't care enough to show up for a party. I'm glad they didn't. so they wouldn't have to deal with the monster that was losing patience with me. I don't think you've earned an easy death. I was going to be kind. You wouldn't even consider my simple request. Tell me your sins. Explain to me why someone hated you enough to request my assistance. The voice got more intense with each word. The door shook, causing me to cower as far away as possible. While I was on the floor shaking like a leaf, I realized I really needed to clean behind the toilet more often. I swear, on my life, I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, can't you give me a little hint? I begged, tears starting to come to my eyes. Okay, don't you dare judge me. I bet most of you would have had the same reaction. A hint. Let me jog your memory. The door stopped rattling for a little while. I almost thought it was over, but this damn bastard had cheat codes or something. All at once, the entire room shook. The lights flickered as deafening thumping noises overtook the small space. Slowly, a black mass appeared from out of the mirror. I uselessly tossed anything nearby, which harmlessly bounced off the creature's face. It had long black hair that spilled down to the floor. Layers of a black lace veil covered the face, but two glowing eyes shone through. Long, dark arms twisted out from the mirror, pulling the rest of the body forward. I screamed and pressed myself hard against the wall. This couldn't be happening. I might be able to accept it a little better if there was a reason I could understand as a motive for the attack. The long, sharp finger reached out, stopping inches away from my face. Now, little Ryan, repent. I barely heard the words over the shaking and thudding. If I didn't, I would have been dead. My name isn't Ryan, it's Pat, I shouted. I curled into a ball, my hands gripping my hood tight over my eyes to blind myself to the horrors. Don't lie to me, you... I have mail, I shouted again, sounding like a small child. Slowly, the sounds and shaking started to die down. When I felt brave enough, I carefully peeked out. Nothing but an empty bathroom. Did I have a mental breakdown? I still felt the rip in my costume showing. I must have done that to myself, if I did break for some reason. I almost convinced myself that that was what was happening. I finally stood up and the bathroom door swung open. The monster stood on the other side, the lanky body dressed in a baggy black sweater and sweatpants that he wasn't wearing before. I screamed for a few minutes. Are you... he started to ask. No, I wasn't done. I screamed once more, just in case. Anyway, the creature started and lifted not only some of my mail, but also my ID. The jerk went through my wallet. I swear to God, he took my stamped coffee cards. Do you have the address for Ryan Thyme? I see some of his mail here, but it looks like you're the only one who lives here, the monster said. And he sounded normal. He dropped his raspy, scary voice. In my sheer terror before, I didn't realize the person that I bought the house from, who lived here before, was named Ryan. I sometimes get his mail since he only recently moved out. Oh yeah, I do. You told me his new address to forward mail and such. Is he the guy you were supposed to kill? I slowly asked. Well, you humans look the same, all right. He stomped, getting extremely defensive very quickly. Wow, that's racist. I'll gut you. He won that small argument. He backed up to let me out of the bathroom so I could find where I wrote Ryan's address. I folded the paper, aware of red eyes on my back. I didn't want to hand over the info if that meant someone was going to die just to save my own skin. You're going to kill him, aren't you? I said, my hands starting to shake. Brutally, he confirmed. I shook my head, feeling sick with fear. If I was quick, maybe I could eat the paper or do something to save another person's life. If you must know, he killed a family of 4 drunk driving, but fled before the cops got to the scene. The creature explained calmly. Oh, I guess Ryan's time is up. Get it? Because his last name. I let the joke die. I handed the paper to the monster, more embarrassed than scared at that point. I expected my unwanted guest to leave, but he hung around. It felt a bit surreal, staring down at a nightmare, casually standing in my kitchen. Listen, about the mix-up. This doesn't really happen with me. If it gets back to my bosses, I'll lose my monthly bonus. I have mouths to feed and all, he awkwardly said. You have kids? I replied, horrified that there was more of him. Cats. I should have guessed. I mean, he seemed like a cat person. I was just glad to be alive. I didn't even know how to contact who he worked for. I mean, I needed to pretend as if I did in case he decided to take care of some loose ends. Do you really live alone? You have a lot of soda for one person, he commented, his eyes directed to the counter. I bought some bottles and extra snacks for the party that never happened. His question was because he was worried that I had roommates that might have heard what went down. I wanted to have a party, but no one showed up, I shrugged. Lame. He should have just killed me. Besides that fact, my life was still in danger. I needed him to believe I wasn't going to tell his boss about his mix-up. If I made it as an exchange, that might work. But what on earth would I ever want from someone like him? So I didn't snitch. In exchange for my silence, do you want to hang out? I offered. There was a full minute of silence between us. What? He asked in a way that needed him to wind up for the one word. I got all these snacks and all these movies lined up, I defended myself. Do you got those pumpkin cookies? He said as he turned the piece of paper around between his fingers. The Pillsbury sugar cookies? I said, not knowing if he meant those or some sort of pumpkin-flavored cookies. Yeah, those bitches, was the blunt reply. I can't believe those cookies were going to save my life. I nodded, and the deal was made. Somehow I had my party, a very awkward Halloween party, but it still counted. Turns out the creature that looked like he belonged in a horror movie jumped at cheap moments while watching them. He also ate a lot, even though he was so thin. I made 6 boxes of those cookies, which he easily put away. I saw him eyeing the pumpkin, which I was going to offer for him to carve if he wanted. Instead, he just ate them raw. I never saw what was under the dark veil that covered his face, but I saw he tore through a large pumpkin in 2 bites. The jagged teeth marks made me glad I sacrificed pumpkins to save my skin. Near the end of the night, he looked ready to leave. With a stretch, he hovered by the front door. Are you going to hand out Halloween candy? It was weird just how normal he sounded. Yeah, I don't work that night. Let me come over. I want to scare some teens after I finish this job. I rarely get to do anything that isn't disemboweling on Halloween, he admitted. Horrifying mental image, but okay. It wouldn't kill me hanging out with him again. Okay, I mean, maybe it might. To my shock, he gave me a cell phone number to reach him. I realized then I never got his name. What do I call you? I mean, do you have a name like Red Eye Ripper? Brian. Red Eye Ripper was my father's name. I let myself laugh over that one. If you couldn't laugh with the inhuman monster that almost ripped you apart, then who could you joke with? I let him leave with the plan to see each other at least one more time. I'm sure I didn't sleep for 48 hours after the whole experience, and I know Brian's off killing people, but it's nice to have a friend that you can hang out with on Halloween. I might ask him if he could repair my frog costume, or if he could pay me back for ripping it. On second thought, I'll just eat the cost. I awoke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the bedside table. Hello? I said groggily. You're that paranormal hunter, right? I had the website changed, new business cards made up, and even sunk some money into an ad campaign. Still. All callers insisted on referring to me as the paranormal hunter. A term originally coined by tabloid papers who made me out to be some sort of monster-fighting hero. It wouldn't be so bad if it didn't negatively affect my livelihood. Those articles made me a laughingstock to skeptics everywhere, including the local authorities that I sought to work with on occasion. Actually, it's paranormal consultant. Right, sorry. I need your help. She sounded like the rest. Scared, confused, and at the end of her rope. I was the last call anyone made in a situation like this. A desperate cry for help when all else failed. It's as if dialing the number was some admittance of insanity, or worse, A confirmation that the things that go bump in the night are really out there, waiting in the shadows to pounce on their next victims. I'm here to help. What can I do for you? She let out a long sigh before continuing. Well, you're not going to believe this. That's what they all say. I received this odd list of rules in the mail. I didn't pay it any mind at first, thinking it's a mix-up at the post office, but now, every time I unknowingly break a rule... Let me guess. There's some sort of strange paranormal consequence. Yes, exactly! How did you know? Lists like these had been popping up all over the country. Some in hotel rooms, others in apartments or employee manuals. They're all the same. Paranormal calamity befalls any victim who will refuse to follow the guidelines. When enough rules are broken, it usually results in the person's death. Not to worry. I've dealt with this kind of thing before. I'll take your case. Just text me your address and I'll be right over. Thank you so much. I wasn't sure that you'd believe me. In my line of work, it pays to have an open mind. After disconnecting and throwing on some clothes, I got into my car and took off in the direction of her house. It was in town, so the drive was a short one. Upon arriving, my new client rushed out to greet me. Oh, thank God you're here. I'm at my wit's end. Her arms were crossed and breathing labored. She was clearly out of sorts. Oh, sorry, where are my manners? I'm Jessica. Nice to make your acquaintance. I'm Henry. Jessica was young, maybe mid to late 20s, dark hair, freckled skin. I probably would have found her attractive if she didn't remind me of my daughter. Please, come in. We walked to the front door and entered the house. After hanging up my hat, I took a look around. It was a lovely home, quaint but spacious. Can I get you some coffee? No, thanks. If it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to get right to work. Do you have the list? She picked up a sheet of paper from the coffee table and handed it to me. There were 10 rules in total. How many rules have you broken so far? She looked embarrassed. 7, altogether. That's good, Jessica. I mean, it means there's still time. Still time for what? She asked. Time to end things. I pulled a lighter out of my pocket and held the flame beneath the page. What are you doing? Not many people know this, but burning a list before all the rules are broken summons the demon who wrote it. She glared at me, petrified, a look of absolute fear across her face. Demon? The flame spread to the outer edges of the paper. Yes. These lists are powerful demonic contracts. With every rule you break, you're tempting fate, inviting the demon to absorb your soul. My soul? The page had all but burned up now. Yes, they feed off them. With a list like this, the demon has access to your soul. Every misstep is another chance to feed. After all rules are broken, your soul is theirs completely, as per the unwritten terms of the contract. The sheet of paper turned to ash and fell to the floor. Jessica started to ask another question, but I held my hand up to stop her. Wait. It's coming. We watched as a cloud of smoke formed at the center of the living room. It grew until it reached the ceiling and then swirled around faster with each passing second. After a minute or so, it dissipated, revealing the demon within. Hello, Henry. It took the form of a man in the turn-of-the-century attire, gray hair, gray mustache. Jessica walked over and stood by his side. I see you've met my daughter. Now I'd be lying if I said I wasn't surprised at this revelation. But all signs of foul play were there that I should have picked up on it sooner. No car in the driveway, no family photos on the wall, no signs of a struggle in the house, despite Jessica having broken most of the rules. What is this? The demon laughed. You've made quite the impression downstairs with your heroic shenanigans over the years. I've been tasked with eliminating you. I reached into my coat for a weapon, but the demon gestured for me to stop. Please, Henry, I have another idea in mind. Why don't we make a deal? I scoffed. A deal, huh? What exactly do you have in mind? He smiled. Give me your soul, and I will bring back your daughter. My heart sank. Chelsea was the whole reason I hunted supernatural things in the first place. She died over a decade ago in a house fire. one that I discovered after years of investigation was caused by some unknown entity. I was never the same after that. Instead of grieving in the way most parents do, I made it my life's work to track down her killer, and everything like it. What do you say, Henry? It's a fair trade. I would give anything to see Chelsea, even my soul. But not like this. Demonic resurrections always came with side effects. It was very likely that if Chelsea was brought back, she would succumb to an insatiable bloodthirst, not unlike that of the demons themselves. I could never put her through something so terrible. Not a chance. His lips contorted into a wicked grin. I thought you might say that. That's why I had my daughter slip something into your pocket. Confused, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper. There were 3 rules written on it. 1. Don't enter the house. 2. Don't burn the list. And 3. Accept the demon's deal. Son of a bitch. Without knowing it, I had broken all the rules on the list, giving this demon full access to my soul. All he had to do now was come and take it. Sorry, Henry. You're mine now. Their skin melted away, dripping from their frames like candle wax, revealing the red, connective tissue underneath. Then their eyes turned black and their mouths open wide, no teeth or tongues within, just empty pits of blackness. One kiss would suck the life right out of me. Before I could reach into my coat pocket again, Jessica leapt across the room and pinned me to the wall, forcing her mouth against my face. My soul began to untether itself from me. The sensation was a strange one. There was an immense feeling of pain, but also heartache, the likes of which I had only felt once before. As soul and body separated, something bubbled to the surface. It wasn't so much my life flashing before my eyes as it was a single memory playing out in my mind. I'll be fine, Dad. Stop worrying. I know, it's just that... Chelsea interjected. I'm your little girl. It's your job to worry about me. Am I that predictable? She smiled. Only when it comes to caring about me. I looked around the house, and it saddened me. I was happy for Chelsea, but I couldn't believe how quickly she'd grown up. You know, you can come visit sometime, right? It's only a 2-hour flight. I can pay for the ticket. Just say the word whenever you feel you want to. Dad, I'm still your daughter. I'll visit when I can, but you have to come to terms with the fact that I'm an adult with a life of my own. Between work and college, I can't always come when you call, okay? I laughed as a tear ran down my cheek. So you're the parent now. Is that it? She laughed. If you don't leave soon, you're gonna miss your flight. She was right. I admit, I was cutting it pretty close. I know, I'm gonna miss you, that's all. I miss you too, Dad. I'm only a phone call away. And with that, I left the house and I drove to the airport. Little did I know it then, but that would be the last time I ever saw my little girl alive. I hadn't thought of that day in quite some time. It was locked away deep in my heart, for fear of the feelings that it would invoke in me. In this dire moment, my life hanging in the balance, it served as a reminder. A reminder of why I did the things no one else would dare to do. Why I fought to save others and kill things that left evil in their wake. It was all for her. With what strength I had left, I reached into my coat, pulled out a blade, and plunged it into Jessica's side. She backed off and fell to the floor, writhing in pain. Silver! I couldn't kill demons, but it sure as hell slowed him down. Before the man could come to his daughter's aid, I quickly sliced my hand open and used the blood to paint a sigil on the wall. One push at the center and the demons would vanish, cast back into the underworld where they belonged. It was a temporary fix, but I was in no condition to fend them off. "Henry, wait!" The man called out to me, my hand over the sigil ready to send him packing. "Don't you want to know what happened to Chelsea?" He was stalling. I could tell, but I had the upper hand, and I could afford to hold off for a moment. It might have been foolish, but I gave in to my curiosity and listened. She screamed when the flames overtook her. Her skin peeled and flaked while she cried. He was lying. He didn't know what happened. And still, I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Even a fabricated story about my daughter was better than no story at all. As morbid as it sounds, it made me feel closer to her. His words offered a setting in which I could fantasize about saving her. Something I often did but struggled to picture. It was an addiction of mine. She was so terrified, she couldn't stop speaking nonsense, counting backwards from 10. I killed her before the fire could, just to shut her up. My blood ran cold. That was something I taught her when she was little. "Dad, help!" I woke to Chelsea screaming and ran to her bedroom. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" Her breathing was sporadic. Something certainly had her rattled. "It's here! The monster!" It was another one of her night terrors. Ever since her mother died, she'd get them at least twice a week. Every time I'd come to the rescue and calm her down. "Okay, sweetie, just a bad dream. You're still sleeping." She wouldn't let up. "It's gonna get me!" I took her in my arms and I held her. "Remember what I taught you. Count backwards from 10. It'll all fade away." She whimpered for a moment and then she began counting. 10, 9, 8, 7. Her breathing was becoming more even and controlled. 6, 5, 4, 3. She stopped crying and loosened her grip on my arm. 2, 1. And just like that, she was awake, free of the nightmares that plagued her. "All right, sweetie. You okay now? Go back to sleep." She offered me an innocent smile and crawled back under the covers. I left the door open just a crack, enough so that I could hear her and come running if she needed me. Just like I did every time. He had been telling the truth. He could have never known about that otherwise. "Well, Henry, I'm the one who killed her all those years ago. She had a list just like yours and broke every rule. I showed up to collect." My heart nearly stopped right then and there. All this time spent chasing monsters, and he was right here in the same room with me, the thing responsible for taking my little girl's life. "Come on, Henry. Don't you want to avenge your daughter?" My hand hovered over the sigil. Jessica was still on the floor. It took everything in me not to pull away and lash out. That's just what he wanted. He knew I didn't have the energy needed to kill him, not with my soul tattered. She begged for her life, you know. It was pathetic. I was dangerously close to taking the bait. All I could see was Chelsea's house going up in flames. You were her father. Why didn't you save her, Henry? I needed to calm down, otherwise I'd surely retaliate and be as good as dead. No more hunting, no more lives to save, no killing this demon once and for all. Some father you were, leaving your girl out in the world to die alone. I counted backwards in my head. 10, 9, 8. What's the matter, Henry? Too scared to fight back. It was working. The anger and sadness was still there, but his voice was fading from the foreground. 7, 6, 5. I can only imagine what's happening to her soul downstairs. Oh, the humanity. The adrenaline in my veins was slowing. 4, 3,
2. This is your only chance you'll ever have, Henry. It's now or never. 1. Calmer than I was before. I pushed my hand onto the sigil with as much force as I could muster. No! He cried out. But it was no use. His and Jessica's bodies vanished in a flash of light, leaving behind only an unpleasant burning odor and faint impressions where they were on the carpet. Thank God that's over. I stumbled out to the car and got into the driver's seat, feeling a bit better than I had just moments before. Before driving off, I took one last look at the house, feeling a regret similar to when I left Chelsea years before. This isn't over. With that, I took off down the road, wounded, but with some newfound clarity. I knew what I had to do, and no person or thing is going to stop me. That demon's life will be mine. With the information he gave me, there was another matter I had to attend to first. I'm going to save Chelsea's soul.
I hadn't thought about it until last week, but it seems to have snowballed into something that's gotten out of control. I was looking through some photos while helping my mother move when I saw him for the first time in 15 years. Dad had passed away a few months ago. Mom was just starting to clean out some of his things. The picture had been taken at a birthday party, my 9th birthday party, and it showed my friends and I standing in front of the house, smiling as my mom took the picture. There were about 9 of us, all wearing party hats with ice cream mustaches under our noses, but the happy faces of my friends and I weren't what caught my eye. It was the gaunt man standing in the window of the living room, the one looking out at us with the empty black eyes and the sinister little smile. A man who had haunted my childhood, though I'd never quite believed in him after the age of 12. Mr. Danver. A specter that my late father had brought to life. I remember the first time I ever heard of Mr. Danver, and the memory made my skin crawl. It wasn't scary because of what I'd been told, but because of the unwilling way my father had shared it. I was 5 and we were getting ready to go to preschool. I hadn't slept well the night before and I was cranky as I sat at the table and picked at my breakfast. I was wearing half my school clothes, 1 sock, no shoes, and I was so far from being ready that when my father saw me, you could just tell he knew we were going to be late. Come on, kiddo. You gotta get a move on. Finish your breakfast, get your clothes on. Find your shoes, let's get on the road. I don't even remember what I said to him. Something snarky, grumpy. And when he turned back to me, he spoke before he had quite made up his mind to. Better hurry and get ready before Mr. Danver comes to get you. The silence that hung after that statement was enough to make me turn my head to look at him. And that's why I saw him when he slowly put a hand over his mouth. He was looking at me like he'd just sworn, and he was afraid that I would start repeating it. He seemed terrified by the notion of what might suddenly come out of his mouth. "Who's Mr. Danver?" I asked. And that seemed to seal the deal. Dad went rigid. Not all at once, but slowly, like something petrifying. His eyes stared out at nothing, his mouth opening a little bit as he gasped slightly. His body seemed to be trying to fight whatever was going on and failing, his mind railing against the inevitable. He looked like a landed fish, struggling to breathe even as it struggled with the hook that had pulled it from the waters of life. And when I asked the question a second time, the hook seemed to find its anchor, and he stopped fighting. He comes for bad kids, naughty kids, and kids who don't listen. He finds where they hide, and they go missing. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He's tall and old, with skin so thin. His hair is wisps, gray as tin. His teeth are sharp. His eyes are black. He'll drag you off and you'll never come back. When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He delivered it all in the well-trained cadence of an off-Broadway actor at an audition. It sounded like something he had repeated 1,000 times, and I realized even then that it was something I would never forget. The scariest part about it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The voice was so different from Dad's that it was like watching a ventriloquist talk through him. Suddenly it felt like a stranger was in the house, and I shuddered as a cold chill ran through me. I didn't say anything in the face of that silence, but when I lifted a hand to my eyes, I realized I was crying. Large, silent tears were sliding down my face, and as my dad came out of his trance, he started crying too. He came to scoop me into his arms and pressed me to his chest as he repeated the same thing again and again into my corn silk hair. I'm sorry, God help me, I'm so sorry. When Mom came home to find us both watching Disney movies on the couch, she asked why he had called out of work and not taken me to school. When he explained the situation in soft tones, he pressed his mouth against her ear, and she joined us on the couch and pulled me into her lap. That was the first night I saw the old specter, but it wouldn't be the last. I woke up with the most profound chill I'd ever had. It ran up my cheek like mice feet, and my eyes popped open as I lay in my bed. The room was dark, my toys casting shadows across the floor as the moon crept in through the window. But I knew those spooky shapes were not the source of my discomfort. I could almost imagine that I heard the song Dad had sang as it scampered in with the air conditioning in the vent. I could see the dust motes and the moonbeams as they boogied to the haunting chorus. And as I stared at them, that's when I saw him. He was hunkered down in the corner, his knees against his chest and his arms resting on his knees. He was looking at me from the pit of shadows where he sat. And when he realized I was looking back at him, I saw a wide grin stretch across his face. His toothy mouth stretched ear to ear, and as he stood up, I could hear his joints popping like kindling wood. His hair sat neatly on his head, looking like the hair you saw in zombies and horror movies, and it brushed the ceiling as he stood. He rose until his head nestled in the corner of the ceiling, his frame all of 8 feet tall. He had a hat in his hand, a round thing I would later learn was called a bowler hat, and his arms were covered by a rich black suit coat. He was wearing a suit beneath, but I was only vaguely aware of it. As he rose, the moon casting his features in contrast, I was mesmerized by his eyes. They were dark pits of shadow that looked at me with mirthful knowledge. "Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice sounding like someone who'd lost their breath to excitement. "I just wanted a peek. I'm sure I'll get a closer look sometime. Toodaloo." I started screaming then, and when Dad came in and turned the lights on, there was nothing in the corner but the star stickers that stuck to the ceiling above the spot. Those stickers never glowed again. I took them down when I noticed and threw them away. I was afraid he'd gotten his taint on them. Dad pulled me into a hug, Mom beside him, and hugged me too in an instant, and both of them held me until the shaking stopped. After that, I saw him anytime I did something disobedient. Sometimes I'd see him lurking in the corner of my vision if I said something smart to my mom or dad. Sometimes I'd feel those black eyes watching me if I didn't do my chores on time. There were a few times when I heard him laughing after I'd gotten angry at my mom, and I was always quick to apologize and make things right. Mr. Danver made me conscious of my actions in a way that I'd never been before. And I was a better person because of it. I never saw him when I was rude to my friends, but just the knowledge that he might be watching me made me forgive more often, and I was less likely to be cruel to others. Sometimes when I thought about cheating on a test or taking something from a store, I'd imagine him just waiting to get me, and I'd think better of it. It all culminated when I was 12, on the day I ran away from home. I'd been looking forward to a sleepover at my friend's house that weekend, an event that was highly anticipated. Matt had had one of those for his birthday every year, and a bunch of us would go to his house and eat junk food and watch movies, tell scary stories, and just to have the time of our lives. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and I knew that if Mom found the math test at the bottom of my bag, the one with a big red F on it, I could hang it up. I'd buried it deep in my backpack, but not deep enough, apparently. She'd found it before I could make my escape to the party, and we got into a screaming match over it. It was unfair, I told her. I had looked forward to this party for so long. It wasn't fair that now I didn't get to go. She said that was too bad, and that if parties were more important than my schoolwork, then I needed to get my priorities in order. I was so mad, so furious with my mom that I did the unthinkable before I could remember the specter of Mr. Danver. I told her I was going, whether she gave me permission or not, and walked out the door before she could stop me. I ran up the street heading for Matt's house, listening to my mom call from behind me. I expected her to be angry. I expected her to be upset. Instead, she just sounded scared. She told me to come back, that we could talk about this, but I was in no mood to listen. I was going to the party whether she liked it or not, and nothing was going to stop me from getting there. It wasn't until I saw him standing under a burnt-out street lamp that I remembered the looming threat of Mr. Danver. When it began to flicker, I realized it had a little more juice in it. In the flickering light, I could see the tall, thin frame as he grinned at me, his translucent skin clinging to his face like a mask. He had his hat in his hand again, his immaculate suit still looking pristine in the flickering light. His eyes reflected that flicker like a stuffed animal's. He looked unreal, standing in the everyday world like a piece of Halloween decoration that was a little too well made. He was utterly still, his head brushing the bottom of the lamp, but his fingers gave away his excitement. They drummed on the brim of the hat and made him look like a dog preparing to yank his lead and give chase. We stood and looked at each other for a count of 5 before I turned and shot off towards home. Mr. Danver was coming after me just as fast, but his lack of footfalls made me panic all the more. I turned to look and saw the too tall thing eating up the ground. His long legs moved like a spider's, and he ran like a cartoon character in big, exaggerated galumphs. He was gaining on me with every step, his strides twice my own, and I screamed in frustration and terror as I put on the extra burst of speed. To think that a moment of frustration was going to seal my fate forever. I had been so hyper-fixated on my behavior for so long, and now a sudden lapse in judgment was going to kill me. When Mr. Danver came to town, you better beware. The wind seemed to bring the hateful words to my mind as it rushed past my ears. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. And I was scared. I was terrified, and when my house came into view, I was afraid that I would get snatched within view of the front door. Mr. Danver would reach out with one long arm and pull me into the darkness, and I would be gone forever. It would happen just that quick, and no one would know what had gotten me. Correction, my parents would know. They would know, but how could they tell anyone? To admit to such would make them sound nuts. Probably make people think they had been responsible for my disappearance. I turned suddenly, going through the gate and running up the walk. I felt the icy chill of Mr. Danvers' hand as it passed inches from me. I took the steps 2 at a time, praying the door would be unlocked, and when Mom threw it open, I leapt into her arms. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please, please, please don't let him take me." I pressed my face against hers, not daring to look back out into the yard. Mom whispered that she forgave me. But when she talked to Mr. Danver, her voice was a mixture of rage and old fear. "Get out of here. All's forgiven. There's no misdeed. You can't take him." I kept my face pressed against my mom, but I still heard Mr. Danvers' spidery voice when he answered. "Another time, then." And when I peeked back, he was gone. Dad came home an hour later, getting off early after Mom called him, but I was still shaking and sobbing on the couch. "Why?" I asked him when he came to join me. "Why did you ever tell me about Mr. Danver?" My dad was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer, before sighing and saying, "Because it's not something I ever meant to do. It happens, and someday it'll happen to you as well." "Never," I whispered. "I never do that to my child." I shuddered as he wrapped me in a hug, but I didn't pull away. "Sweetie, you won't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. My father didn't have a choice. No one has a choice. Once you know about him, the knowledge demands to be shared. His name's dark knowledge, secret, shared by many. And it must be served." That's when he told me how he came to know about Mr. Danver from his father. I don't know, I was playing something on the couch. My dad told me to clean my room. I ignored him, wanted to finish my game, when he said, "If I don't go do it now, you call Mr. Danver." I looked up when he said it. The look on his face was confused and afraid. "Dad, your grandpa wasn't always the nice guy that you know. He joined AA when I was in high school, but before that, he was a drunk. He'd be a mean drunk too, and I should have known better than to hesitate when he asked me to do something. Instead, I asked who Mr. Danver was, and he sang me a little song. It was the soberest I'd ever seen him until that point. The words were forced out of him like vomit. And when he finished, he threw his arms around me and told him how sorry he was. Dad looked at me and his eyes were hollow pits. I saw him in my room that night. It wasn't the last time either. He told a story to Mom, the one about his father telling him about Mr. Danvers. She had cried and said that she'd seen him too. Her dad told her too, and one day, you'll tell your kid. You won't want to, but you won't have a choice. The song is as inevitable as Mr. Danvers. What you got there? I jumped as Mom came in and found me looking at the picture. I put it in my pocket, not wanting to remind her about Mr. Danver if I could help it. I moved on to another box. Mom taking the box of photos that I'd been looking through and tried to put the name out of my mind. It was easy to do as I worked, but I sat at home later, still sore from a day of moving furniture and sorting boxes. I started to think about it. If my parents and I knew about Mr. Danver, did anyone else? I pulled up Reddit and made a post before I could think better of it. I don't know if you could transfer the knowledge like this, but I wanted to know bad enough to find out. Hey guys, just remembered something from when I was a kid. I wanted to know if anyone else had heard of it. My dad told me a spooky story about Mr. Danver. I was a kid saying that he would come get me. My mom knew about it too, but I was wondering if anyone else had heard of it, or if it was something that he made up. It had barely sat for 5 minutes before I got a response. It wasn't the last either. Yeah, my dad told me about it when I was little. Seems like I must have had nightmares about it, because I can remember dreaming he was in the corner of my room sometimes. Oh my god, so weird. That's exactly what my mom called it too. It was weird when she told me too. I thought that she was having a seizure. My uncle used to tell me that he would come and get me if I was bad. Wasn't there a song or a poem that went along with it too? Yeah, it was pretty catchy, but I can't remember all the words. On and on and on and on. The thread had around 100 comments. Not all of them were from Americans either. Mr. Danvers seemed to be something that lived in the consciousness of most English-speaking people, and even if it had a different name, the descriptions they gave were exactly the same. Tall, suited, pale, wispy hair, sharp teeth, black eyes. The description was universal. And the idea that I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better. If you too have experienced Mr. Danvers, it's already too late. One day you'll tell your children. One day they'll have the knowledge. One day, if they're lucky enough to avoid the icy grip of Mr. Danvers, they too will pass it on. The cycle always continues, whether you want it to or not. And one day I too will infect my child with the looming specter of Mr. Danvers. No one could have ruined Thanksgiving more than our brother did. Alan said he was getting clean again. This time he really meant it. He had already checked into rehab and was meeting with his counselor twice a week. He told us that he loved us. Everything from the moment he trudged through the front door and struggled threading his coat over the lone hanger in the closet suggested it was just another one of his tall tales. Tate had made it very clear in the days leading up to Thanksgiving that he was opposed to inviting our older brother over. And deep down, I knew it was a bad idea too. Whenever Alan came back telling us that he was trying to turn his life around, it really meant that he needed us for something. Alan had been a bad egg for the family since our parents died in a car accident while we were boys, and our grandparents stepped up to take us in. He'd been pulling the same bullshit throughout his adolescence, with our grandparents too old and beaten down to rein in on him. So many nights of our teenage years, Tate and I would stay in playing Xbox and watching DVDs only to brace ourselves when he heard footfalls coming up the porch and Alan stumbled in, fucked up and always angry. When our grandparents finally passed, all they had left in their estate was the house to pass down to us. It hadn't taken long for us to grow so sick of the constant parties and Alan's strung-out junky friends passed out on the couch every night that we eventually had to kick him out and try to make our own. 1/3 share of the decaying 2-story house, smack in the middle of St. Paul suburbia, wasn't worth much. It was maybe enough money to float his drug and escort expenses for a couple of months at the most. Wherever the money had gone, it was clear that it had run out by the time that Thanksgiving rolled around. We'd broken our golden rule and opened our doors to him one more time. We'd even tried to take it seriously that year. I'd ordered an organic turkey from a special grocer, and Tate had spent hours preparing sides of potatoes, stuffing, broccoli, salad, and even baked an apple pie for dessert. Alan showed his immense appreciation by wobbling while he struggled to keep his balance in the front hall. His eyes were red around the edges, and he scratched the left side of his cheek like he needed to peel off the outer layer of skin. His plaid shirt and jeans, with paint stains all around the knees, looked like they were on their 10th time being worn without a wash. His eyelids twitched. He looked all over the room like he had trouble making out the familiar shapes around him. He smiled at us, and we feigned smiles back. We were both so nervous, just how far off the deep end would this night go? Perhaps we'd have to physically force him out if things got out of hand. Make sure the house was dry. He even hid the wine and whiskey glasses so we couldn't get inspired. There was a glass pitcher with ice water smack in the middle of the table, and that's all that the three of us would have to drink that night. "You want to sit on the couch?" Tate gestured towards the living room and then headed back for the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. Just need to set the table and I'll bring everything out." Alan stared at the dinner table like the idea of sitting down scared him half to death. "Nah, bro. I'll stand for now." He kept
fidgeting at the front door. He kept looking over his shoulder and out the window. Like, even he knew that this whole thing was a bad idea. He should just make an excuse to jump ship for all of our sakes. Just gotta get something out of my car. I'll be right back. He slammed the door behind him before either of us had a chance to answer. We looked at each other and shrugged. The whole thing was all too expected, like we were reading from a script. He probably wanted an extra hit of whatever he'd been on all day before he could stomach sitting down for a period of longer than 15 minutes. There's nothing we could do about it aside from not let it bother us. I started setting cutlery, and Tate brought the food dishes over one by one. The arrangement looked elegant when it was complete. Our late grandmother would have been proud if she was still around to see it. We gave Alan another 5 minutes before we started eating without him. It wasn't something that needed to be debated. We didn't need to bother checking on him to see if he was coming back. The food would only get colder, with more time spent on a wasted cause. We scooped big portions onto our plate, and we started digging in. Eating with just the two of us didn't hurt that badly. I mean, it never does when you prep yourself for the worst case scenario ahead of time. We both loosened our belts and sat there at the table for some time when we were done. Every once in a while, I would glance over to the door, waiting for a moment where Alan would burst in like nothing had happened, with some cooked-up story about how he got a call from a friend in need, or how he couldn't find whatever the hell he was looking for in his car. And then it hit me. That degenerate didn't have a car. He'd never owned one. He hadn't even tried to get his license, as best as I could remember. I went to the front window and peered out. The driveway was empty, as I'm sure it had been the entire time. Alan probably had one of his junkie friends drop him off, or he just walked all the way from whatever ghetto part of town he'd lived in. Probably took off down the street the moment that he realized he wasn't mentally stable enough to sit down for a proper dinner with his brothers. It seemed like all the neighbors were entertaining Thanksgiving company, with their narrow driveways on sprawling city lots stuffed with 3 or 4 cars at least. A single black van was parked on the street directly in front of our house. It's one of those 90s GMC Savannas with no windows lining in the back. I pictured Alan hunched over inside, desperately taking another hit before he could find the confidence to come back in. The van shook, gently, but no door ever opened. I drew the curtains shut, and then my phone started buzzing on the counter where I'd left it, trying not to distract myself from other precious family meals. Sure enough, it was Alan's phone, and the rational part of me was screaming to let it go to voicemail. Then again, maybe I'd found the confidence to tell him how I truly felt over the phone. The cat always seemed to have my tongue whenever I saw him in person. At first, all I heard were gasps on the other end of the line. When Alan's voice finally came through, it was shrill and desperate. Something was wrong. He didn't have the finesse to fake it all that well. He stumbled over his words and couldn't find a way to string more than a couple together at a time. It was so predictably infuriating. He'd managed to fuck himself up swiftly. And I didn't want to piss away any more time trying to figure out what was wrong with him. I wished I could have been jaded enough to just hang up the phone right then and there. I glanced back at Tate, who slouched forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees. He stared back at me apathetically, no more interested in the gibberish he could hear coming from the other line. When Alan was finally able to find his words, he was suddenly composed. "Y'all to come to the reservoir behind the house. Come down here to stretch my legs and slipped. Need some help getting up." "The fuck are you doing back at the reservoir, Alan? You said you were going to your car and there's nothing in the goddamn driveway." "I need to stretch my legs." "Sorry, brother. I need you to come back and help me up. Messed up my ankle real good." "Get your ass up and hobble back here yourself. We'll pack you a doggy bag and you can walk your ass home." Suddenly Alan's voice became very stern, threatening even. "Listen, brother. You and Tate walk down here to the reservoir now, or I'm going to call up my junkie friends to go over there and make you. Y'all like that?" I looked at Tate again, and it was clear he could still hear Alan word for word. He got up from his seat and went to put his jacket on. I stood there speechless. Alan erupted into a burst of shrill laughter on the other end of the line, like he'd gotten the upper hand. He hung up before I could find any more words. what are we gonna do? I asked Tate, while he fished through the front cupboard looking for gloves and a hat. I guess we'll go down to the reservoir. The reservoir was a quarter-mile walk downhill from the end of our backyard. I'd always felt lucky that we had it there. I meant, our property was one of the rare spots in the city where we didn't have neighbors towering over our backyard. I'd fished some old flashlights out from underneath the kitchen sink, and both of us hopped over and headed back. It was surprising Alan would have made it back here on his own. He would have been forced to hop a fence somewhere. I wondered what condition we'd find him in. Maybe he'd be lying on his back, flailing in the dirt after the adrenaline rush that he had on the phone had faded. Maybe he'd be sitting calmly on one of the concrete slabs, trying to downplay the whole thing and claim that I was overreacting. It was surprisingly dark once we got down there. Suppose we were far enough away from any of the suburb streets to get much illumination. We panned the flashlights all over the empty space. Saw the familiar concrete blocks with little weeds poking out between them, all the way down to the sewer opening. Cars whizzed by on the overpass a couple of blocks to the west. Everything looked as was it should. Except, Alan was nowhere to be seen. Fucker, Tate said under his breath. He's never where he says he is. There wasn't any use in pissing away any more time looking for him. We started our way back towards the house. Wherever Alan was, and however he had made his distress so convincing over the phone, we weren't going to let it be our problem anymore. I was determined to draw my line in the sand from that point forward and make sure that I wouldn't let my older brother or his predictable actions invade my thoughts for the remainder of the evening. The plan lasted maybe 2 minutes. We realized that Alan had once again fucked us over before we even made it inside the house. The rear door had even been left swinging open in the cold November air. The whole place had been ravaged. All the dishes had been knocked off the table with the leftovers smeared deliberately all over the floor. Pictures had been pulled off the wall, and all the cupboard drawers had been yanked out and tossed around. Tate dashed to the front door, which had also been left hanging open, and locked it. I ran to the garage to grab 2 baseball bats, which I was thankful hadn't been stolen. We went through the house together, slowly growing more horrified as we realized that everything portable and remotely valuable had been taken. Even our grandmother's gold necklace, which she had passed to her mother and then passed back to her, was gone. We kept it in a little nook behind the fireplace for that very reason of mitigating it being stolen. Only Alan, or someone who knew us well, could have thought to look there. Amid all the contempt that I felt towards my older brother in that moment, I was amazed he had composed himself well enough to divert us so convincingly, and even further, impressed that he was so quick to clean us out. We were gone out of the house for 7 or 8 minutes, at the most. He'd made remarkably quick work of it. Suppose that kind of talent came with time and practice. Tate and I said very little to each other for the remainder of the evening. We picked up as best we could and made our way to bed, both of us taking our baseball bats with us for protection. I triple-checked that every door and window was locked before turning out the lights. I'd be damned if I ever let that fucker step foot in the house again. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I'd spent more time tossing and turning than I did lying still. The anger had seeped down to my core and rotted my thoughts from the inside out. For whatever little amount of time I managed to stay asleep, the resentment towards my older brother found its way to wriggle into every corner of my dream. It was exactly 2 a.m. when I first started hearing the tapping. It didn't feel real at first, more like I was still half stuck in the midst of one of my nightmares. However, the longer it persisted, the more impossible it became to ignore. I was particularly grateful for a purpose to get out of bed. I thought maybe the wind was blowing the tops of one of the trees and it was scattered across the backyard against the window. I drew the curtains, thinking nothing of it at first, when I saw Alan standing there at the 2nd-story level. I would have thought that I was still dreaming, had my heart not skipped several beats. The window occupied the upper 2/3 portion of the wall. There was a narrow ledge of brick lining the outside that you could maybe get just enough of your toes on top of to support your weight. And even then, it couldn't explain how he'd managed to climb up there in the first place. There was no access point that I could think of. His head was maybe a foot or two above mine. His skin looked sickly white in the pale light from the street. He looked back at me with dead eyes. The look of a man strung out and barely in touch with the reality around him. The kind of semi-catatonic state that you would need to be in to think that climbing up there was a good idea in the first place. I took a step back, and he leaned forward and pressed his cheek against the glass. I tried to scream for Tate, but no sound escaped my mouth. Was my older brother seriously about to break in through the second-story window? He had tried all entry points of the first floor and was now resorting to checking if I'd overlooked locking one of the windows on the second? His hand stretched to the far right end. It looked like he was trying to wedge his fingers into the crack between the window and the wall. The rage that had been bottled up within me the entire night started to spill out. No social restraint could hold it back right then and there. I started punching the glass and driving my shoulder into it. I tried to create enough force to startle him enough so he would lose his grip and fall back to the lawn below. "Fuck you, Alan! Fuck you!" I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I launched myself harder into the glass. Still, he didn't budge. It's almost like he didn't acknowledge that I was even there. He was so focused on that space between the wall and the edge of the window. The commotion had been enough to wake Tate up. His footsteps pounded from the room over until he was right up next to me. He looked at me in a state of horror and disbelief. "That asshole's still trying to get in," I said weakly. "What asshole?" Tate asked. I turned back to the window and I saw the space was empty. It was the same for the lawn below and all the surrounding area that we could see. There was no indent on the glass, no scruff marks anywhere that would suggest that he'd fallen back and managed to quickly scurry away. I didn't press hard trying to explain to Tate what I'd seen in the window, but I managed to convince him to camp out in my room for the remainder of the night. I wouldn't let myself sleep another wink. I was doubtful I could even if I tried. We both sat on the floor of my bedroom with our backs against the wall and our bats in between our legs. I kept staring out the window, part of me deep down expecting Alan to try his luck climbing up again. We debated calling the cops at first, but we figured that it wouldn't get us very far unless we could actually track him down. There was still part of me worried about Alan's health, even though it was vastly overshadowed by my innate desire to self-protect. If there was any silver lining in all this madness, it was that there was a distant brotherly bond that had only been strengthened that night between Tate and me. And it all spawned from the disdain from our older brother, just as it always had. And that it always would. It didn't seem like such a long time before the night sky finally started to brighten. Tops of the trees in the backyard started to show their texture, and I could even see back to the reservoir. I might have suggested that we bundled up and walk somewhere high enough where we could be able to catch the sunrise. We could stop somewhere for an early Black Friday breakfast. We both jumped to our feet, ready and able to fight Alan off if he were going to force another confrontation. Footsteps sounded around the side of the house, and then towards the front door, and then, very faintly, a hushed voice whispered something that I couldn't make out. We didn't waste any time. We stormed downstairs with our bats brandished and ready to strike Alan down. There'd be no second guessing this time. Everything was remarkably still on the first floor when we arrived. We tiptoed to the front hall, hoping he'd been foolish enough to stay there, thinking that we hadn't heard him. And right before we reached it, we heard that same voice on the other side. Tate looked at me and nodded. We clutched our bats and unlocked the front door. He tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. He checked the lock again and shook his head. He leaned into it harder the second time, but it still didn't move. I tried pushing with him, and it felt like we were pressing against a brick wall. Something was very wrong. Alan wasn't strong enough to hold the door up against us, even if he tried. We had been barricaded in. There was no other explanation. And that's when I noticed the proof in our surroundings. There was very little of the morning light flooding in downstairs. All the windows, whichever ones weren't already covered by curtains, had been boarded over. No, I said in a panicked voice, and moved to the main floor looking for an exit that wasn't blocked. Why would that asshole lock us in? Tate looked at me, and for the first time in years, I thought I might catch him crying. "Did you hear anything during the night? How could he do it so fast?" he asked. "Come, follow me, I'll show you." Alan's voice sounded shrill from the top of the stairs, like he had been waiting for that exact question. We both sprinted to the bottom steps, and sure enough, we saw our sickly-looking older brother staring down at us from the top. He looked so apathetic, like his sneaking in our house to torture us was so easy it hardly amused him anymore. We stormed up towards him, both our bats were raised, and there was no doubt in my mind that we would have beaten him within an inch of his life if we could have gotten our hands on him. He darted from my room, and we followed, gaining more ground with each step. He had the window wedged all the way open. He hurtled out of it with incredible finesse and landed squarely on his feet in the back lawn. He kept running. He kept running without breaking his stride, and he hopped the fence like it was nothing. He was halfway towards the reservoir, while Tate and I were still trying to figure out how we would shimmy ourselves out. Neither of us could believe it. We looked at each other, and then we gingerly slid our way out the window and fell onto our hands and knees in the lawn. We ran as hard as we could after him, thinking that he could have only gotten so far and wouldn't have anywhere to hide once we had him trapped down there at the reservoir. The harsh reality was that we would never have saw Alan again after that. We looked in every nook and cranny and screamed his name like bloody murder into the early morning air. All to no avail. For the second time that night, he had lured us down there only to disappear. I was lost. I was so angry. I wanted so desperately for Alan to be around so I could take it all out on him. He'd done it. He'd found a way to break us even more than he already had earlier in the night. I turned back to our house and screamed his name one more time. "Alan!" I saw the first of the orange flames rising over the roof shortly before I smelled the smoke. I marched back towards our house like I was in a daze. The flames grew higher and higher, and by the time I reached the back fence, it was like the whole thing had been engulfed in one giant fireball. The house was the last thing he could take from us. What a show he'd put on doing it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I answered it without looking. Alan laughed wildly on the other line. I fell to my knees and I kept listening. The fire had grown taller than the trees. Tate and I spent the next several hours at the police station, sitting in a gray room with nothing but 4 chairs, a metal table, and a circular wall clock next to the door. I don't think the cops ever really suspected us of being guilty of starting the fire, but we definitely raised some eyebrows when we gave our rendition of the events that led up to it. The problem was simple. There was physical evidence to contradict the story we gave them. Once they told us what they knew, they even showed us the evidence in pictures. There was nothing more we could have said to explain ourselves. Alan couldn't have been responsible for tormenting us all night and then ultimately burning down our house because he had been murdered shortly after he told us that he needed to check something in his car. The car he was talking about was really that black van I saw parked in the street in front of our house. It belonged to some drug kingpin who Alan begged to follow him over, promising him that he could get the money from us to pay his debts. The amount he owed was in the 6-digit range. It's the only way that so many higher-ups would have been involved firsthand. Alan must have had a change of heart when he stepped in and saw us, nervous for his visit, and he went back out to plead his case. They dragged him back inside the van, and they slit his throat right on the spot. The police knew about this hours before we called to report the fire. They caught the 2 cronies tasked with dumping Alan's body in a park a couple of blocks over. They already had his body in the morgue. They had the 2 criminals in for questioning. They were selling everyone out well before we were even on their radar. The debt had been worth more than Alan's life alone. He'd been too big of a problem for them for too long. They wanted ours as well. At first, they stormed the house expecting to gun us down while we ate unsuspectingly at the dinner table. Of course, we'd been lured down to the reservoir at the time. They must have just missed us giving the timeline, and they decided to rob us of everything we had before coming back to us later. It took 7 men several hours to board up all the exits in our house quietly in the night without us hearing it, but they were sure that they got every exit. Most certainly my bedroom window. There was no way that we would have been able to get the boards off from the inside. They torched the house after they heard us yelling and running up the stairs, thinking that they would sit and listen to us scream. Only by some miracle did we head down to the reservoir for the second time. They checked my phone for the call logs from Alan, and there was nothing. His phone had been smashed shortly after they'd killed him and tossed into the street. I could still hear his wild laughter in my head, and yet there was no way he could have called. There was no way he could have been back at the window or back inside of our house. There was no way that he was ever actually down at the reservoir. Perhaps he truly did love us.
It was a weird-ass gas station. Maybe not the weirdest Blake Herring had ever seen, but definitely top 5. There was one on the border of New Mexico and Arizona that had a mummy in it. Another he visited in Texas was run by a cult that worshipped a cartoon beaver. He was positive that if he looked hard enough, he'd find a slew of other challengers sprinkled across the lower 48 states. But this one, right here, in his hometown of Los Angeles, California, had to be up there in his personal echelon. The small, non-franchised service mart was located in a part of town Blake hadn't even known existed, until his phone's GPS directed him to take the highway exit about 5 minutes prior. Like most of the other businesses in the area, its sign was written in a language he couldn't identify that looked like a cross between Arabic and Latin. Most of the cars were models he didn't recognize, and the lot was lined with so many trees and flowers it resembled a botanical garden more than a gas station. He pulled into a parking lot beside the building and checked his phone. Its service had dropped the moment that he'd gotten off the highway, and so far, he hadn't been able to pick up a single bar. Opening and closing the GPS app hadn't brought it back to life, and neither had rebooting it. The phone was as useless as a brick. Actually, more useless, since the $1,400 hunk of glass and plastic wouldn't be nearly as handy if he decided to use it to bash his skull open out of frustration. With no way to access the navigation system, he settled on figuring out where he was going the old-fashioned way, by asking for directions. The snack aisles were full of foreign products not carried in regular grocery stores. Some of the branding was in English, but many of the packages had the same curious characters he'd seen plastered on the signs of the local businesses. It was clear he had ended up in an ethnic enclave of some sort, though of what kind he couldn't be sure. He checked his watch. He was supposed to meet Melody at the restaurant in 20 minutes. It was their first date, and he didn't want to screw up his chance to get laid by being late. The clerk behind the cash register was a chubby man with a scraggly goatee that dribbled from his bottom lip like a little hairy rivulet of spittle. His uniform was a green polo that had the station's unreadable name stitched into the right breast pocket of the shirt, but his matching green beanie, embroidered with the number 420 across the forehead, told Blake he was dealing with someone who might not be very helpful. Despite his portly physique and terrible facial hair, there was something youthful about his appearance, as if the face of a 10-year-old child had been seamlessly melded with that of a middle-aged, hypertensive alcoholic. The clerk was watching a horror movie called Murder Dome on a little TV behind the counter when he approached, but was so engrossed in the film that Blake had to ring the bell beside the register to get his attention. The chime caused his head to perk up. He noticed a hint of surprise when the clerk turned to face him. It was only a second, but it had been there. The man had been caught off guard, but it hadn't been the bell that had done so. No, his reaction was too delayed. Instead, it appeared as though the attendant's shock had struck the moment his bloodshot eyes had fallen on Blake. He pulled his beanie down to his brow before he could readjust it. Blake spotted something odd about the man, although What it was, he couldn't quite put his finger on. There was something hiding beneath that hat. He knew that. Something the clerk hadn't wanted him to see. But whatever it was, Blake had only caught a quick glimpse of it, and his eyes hadn't yet communicated to his brain just what it was that had been so peculiar. He pushed the thought to the back of his mind. There were more important things on his docket. "Hi," Blake said. He glanced down to the attendant's chest to read his name tag, which was thankfully in English. Saw that it said P-H-A-R-T, decided that pronouncing it was probably a mistake. They continued on with, I'm lost." "Clearly," replied the cashier. There was a cocky smirk on his face. Blake ignored the smirk and got to the point. "Do you know how to get to Mid-City from here?" "Course," said Fart. The conversation stalled into silence. "Well, are you going to tell me how to get there?" Blake was starting to get anxious. He checked his watch again. "I have a date with an absolute bombshell soon, and I don't want to be late." The attendant pointed out the window. "Turn left at that Poppy's Coffee on the corner. 2 lights down, hang a right. You'll be on Wilshire. Drive east, take you straight to Midtown." Blake flashed an appreciative smile and started for the door, but stopped when a little rack beside the register caught his eye. He leaned forward and examined the boxes hanging on the rack's hooks. "Those are dick pills," said Fart. "I'm sorry, dick pills? Like Viagra?" The clerk nodded his head. "Better than Viagra. You get it all the way from the motherland." "Speaking of that," said Blake, "what kind of neighborhood is this? I can't read any of the signs." "Oh." Fart snuck a sly glance over his shoulder, then whispered, "Most of the people here are Fae." Blake tried to remember where he'd heard the word before, but just thinking about it created a strange disconnect in his mind. Once again, he was reminded about the mystery hiding beneath the stone clerk's hat. The hell had he seen? Figured it was easier to pretend he understood, so he turned his attention back to the dick pills. He wasn't in his prime anymore, but if Melody wasn't fudging the numbers on her dating profile, she was a good 12 years younger than him. He'd be lying to himself if he said that he wasn't nervous about being able to perform up to her expectations. Back when he was younger, such a thing wouldn't have even crossed his mind. But ever since he hit his 30s, he needed regular breaks, and on more than one occasion, even struggled to maintain an erection. He grabbed the box and slid it off the tiny hook to get a better look at it. The picture on the label was a unicorn prancing across a starry backdrop while spurting rainbow-colored fluid from its horn. The animal's face looked as if it was caught in the throes of passion, and upon closer inspection, its horn appeared to be suspiciously phallic in shape. The product name beneath the obscene picture read, Uniload 6000. "I don't know if you want to take that stuff," said the clerk. "It's for dudes with 1 ball. You look like a man with at least 2. Excuse me? "I'm sorry if you had ball cancer. I have both my balls," Blake growled. "Then you don't want to take that stuff. I won't help you. You'll just be wasting your money." Blake placed the box back on the rack and picked up another. There was nothing implied about this package, and a picture of a giant penis covered in white fur with glowing red eyes and muscular, burly limbs. It was standing on an alpine slope and snarling menacingly. In one of its claws, it was holding a skier who was terrified for his life. The title beneath the illustration read Yeti Dick XL. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," said the gas station attendant. "Try the regular Yeti Dick, maybe." "Why?" snapped Blake. "What are you trying to say?" The gas station attendant shied away. "Oh, I just mean you shouldn't start at the XL. Start at the regular dosage, work your way up. Yeti Dick is serious stuff." "Are you, fucking with me?" asked Blake. "I'm just trying to get laid tonight." He pulled another box off the shelf. The label of this one read Cockness Monster. The illustration on the box was reminiscent of the famous photograph of Nessie sticking its head up from the water, only instead of the silhouette of a long-necked dinosaur, it appeared to be the penis. He was starting to see a pattern in the packaging. The back hump that had also breached the water surface, Blake reckoned was most likely a pair of balls. The gas station attendant sucked in some air and readied to speak, but suddenly stopped when Blake shot him a nasty eye. The two stared at each other, an awkward tension swirling between them before Fart finally broke the silence. Sir, I can't recommend that one unless you're into some freaky shit. You know what? Said Blake. Why don't you mind your own business and sell me the damn dick pills? The clerk was getting on his last nerves. Blake slammed the package of Cockness Monster down on the counter along with a pack of condoms. Now, are you gonna ring me up or what? Fart gave in without further protest. I was fine with Blake. He was more than happy to complete the rest of the transaction in silence and get away from this place and never come back. While Fart had been scanning the items, his beanie slipped up his head again. Once more, Blake was able to steal a glance before the attendant managed to pull his hat back down. Only this time, he knew what it was that Fart was hiding. The answer, however, just left him more confused than he was before. It nestled itself into the forefront of his consciousness and made itself at home. Even after he pulled out of the parking lot and turned the corner, he was still thinking about it. It was those ears. Fart had pointed ears. He arrived at the restaurant on time, but Melody wasn't there yet. Blake checked his phone, which had started working as soon as he got out of that weird-ass neighborhood, and saw that he had a text. Running behind, see you soon. He sighed. At least this one had the decency to text him that she'd be late. The last girl he'd made plans with had blown him off to go to a music festival for the weekend. That was the problem with younger women. They're so flighty. Getting them to show up was half the battle. Younger women. He scrubbed the thought out of his head. If Melody was a younger woman, that would mean that he wasn't a younger man, but sure, he might have a few years on her, but at just 37, he had plenty of gas left in the tank. He was still cool. He could still drink and dance, and now that he had his secret weapon, he'd be able to screw all night long. He patted his hip pocket, where he kept the dick pills he'd purchased from the gas station. A finger tapped him on the shoulder. He spun around, expecting to greet his date. The face he found smiling back at him was familiar, but not the one he was hoping to see. His ex-girlfriend, Danny, was standing in front of him. She looked good, which irritated him more than he cared to admit. He scanned her body, hoping that she'd put on weight, but it was clear she was keeping up with her Pilates classes. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and she was wearing a blousey top, matched with a pair of black jeans. "I thought that was you," she said. He and Danny had dated through most of their 20s and separated not long after his 31st birthday. The split hadn't been an amicable one. She'd left him. After years of telling him he needed to grow up, she packed his bags and kicked him out of her condo. There had been a lot of resentment on both sides. As far as Danny was concerned, Blake was a guy with zero prospects and even less ambition. All he cared about was which party he'd be showing up to next. Sure, they had been fun when they were young, but sometime, after she settled into her career as a lawyer and purchased a home, she'd grown tired of his antics. As far as Blake was concerned, Danny had grown frigid, stale in her older age. Outside of her job at the firm, her only hobby had been nagging him. Didn't matter what he did. Every little thing was an excuse to get on his ass. Stay out of the strip clubs until 3 a.m, nag. Take a weekend boys trip to Vegas without telling her, nag. Screw the girl from the gym who always used the Stairmaster, nag. There was no winning with her. It was like she had set impossible standards for him to live up to, and when he couldn't meet her expectations, she kicked him to the curb. Breaking up with Danny had been one of the hardest moments of his life, and yet, after she was gone, it was like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He was free to finally be him. No longer did he have to walk on eggshells around a woman who resented him because he refused to sacrifice his youth for a job at a corporate law firm like she had. Plus, now he could explore his options guilt-free. LA was full of pretty girls, and a good-looking guy like him was having a blast sampling the goods. Blake put his best fake happy shocked face. "Oh my god, Danny! What are you doing here?" "Having dinner with my husband," she said. Even though they drifted apart, they followed each other on social media. It was still odd for him to catch little glimpses of her life. She'd gotten married recently to someone who was the type of guy the two of them used to make fun of in college. Blake had done some light online stalking of him after the engagement announcement. Her husband was an IT specialist named Bob, who ran a weekly D&D campaign out of their house and a foodie blog that only reviewed iced lattes. His hair was graying, his belly was bulging, and even though they had no children, he had all the fashion sense of a middle-aged suburban dad. Simply put, he was a dweeb. An arm fell across Danny's shoulder. She turned and smiled to Bob, who had now joined them. He leaned in and gave her a peck on the lips. "Blake, this is my husband," said Danny. Bob extended a friendly hand and smiled. "Pleasure to meet you," he said. And now, here he was, in all of his goofy glory. At least he'd taken the time to put on a button-up shirt for dinner, although Blake could tell it was in desperate need of tailoring. He nodded and feigned a half-hearted grin, but left Bob hanging. "Just down the street there's this place that does a fantastic horchata iced latte," said Blake mockingly. Bob's eyes widened with amusement. "You don't say!" He gave his wife an eager, hopeful look. "Honey, after dinner, why don't we—" "He's screwing with you, Bob," groaned Danny. She rolled her eyes and huffed. Blake smiled mischievously. Over her shoulder, he caught a sight of the raven-haired beauty he'd come to meet. Thank God, he thought. He was saved. Melody had finally made it. She was wearing a tight red cocktail dress that highlighted her insane body in all the right places. "Excuse me," he said, relieved that he didn't have to make small talk anymore. "That's my date." "Jesus," Danny sneered. "Has she even graduated college yet?" Blake snickered. "She's a liberal arts major." He brushed by the couple. "Like father, like son," she muttered under her breath. But it was loud enough for him to hear it. Blake ignored her quip, then gave Melody a hug and a kiss on the cheek. He let his hands wander over her curves as he shot Danny, who was still watching him, a knowing grin. The two sat down at a table on the opposite side of the restaurant from his ex and her husband. The food was average, and the conversation was even worse. It was clear Melody had a daddy thing that she couldn't keep inside the bedroom. She mentioned more than once during their date that she was into older, more mature men, which made Blake feel kinda gross, but he was willing to overlook that for a girl with an ass like hers. Every now and then, Blake would glance across the restaurant and catch Danny's disapproving eyes. It gave him life. Knowing his ex was aware of the hot, young woman that he'd landed was almost as good as the sex he was planning on having with her. While she'd been forced to share a bed with Dad Bod Bob tonight, he'd be spending the evening with a girl that could easily be a swimsuit model. It no longer mattered if he'd been dumped. As far as he was concerned, he had won the relationship. And yet his mind lingered on Danny's little shot at him. Like father, like son. He knew what she was insinuating. Blake had been dating Danny when his parents got divorced. At the time, he and her used to laugh about the midlife crisis his old man was going through. It was obvious with the convertible that he bought and the younger woman they'd seen him with. One particular night, the two had gone to meet him for dinner, only for Blake's father to show up with a girl that graduated from college with them. They'd all been in the same pre-law track together. But he wasn't anything like his dad. That man was in his 50s when all that was going on. Blake didn't have a gray hair on his head, aside from the couple of whiskers and his beard. But that had been taken care of with some good old-fashioned box dye. "Did you hear me, Daddy?" He winced at that word and then glanced at Melody, who was smiling at him from across the table. He'd been stewing for so long he'd completely tuned her out. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" he asked. She winked. "I said, are you ready to get out of here?" Melody offered Blake a beer when they got back to her apartment, but he declined. He was already 2.5 drinks deep, and he found that nowadays too much alcohol led to performance issues. Not this time, though. He slid his hand into his pocket, and with his fingers, he found the package of dick pills. He was feeling confident tonight. They got into necking almost immediately, and within a couple of minutes, she was straddling him on the bed. His skin tingled. Endorphins began to pump through his brain. This is what he'd been waiting for. He'd had some spectacular conquests before, but Melody would be one of the finest trophies he'd add to his collection. All the hard work he'd put in, the flirty texts, the expensive dinner, the boring conversations had led to this moment. Blake reached behind her and started unzipping her dress, but she put a hand on his chest to stop him. "Let me freshen up first," she said, leaning down and pressing her lips to his, then slid off of his body and made her way to the bathroom. Shit. Almost. But this was fine. It was still happening. He could wait just a few minutes more. Besides, now he'd be able to make sure that he was truly prepared. As soon as the bathroom door closed behind her, he pulled the dick pill from his pocket. He studied the picture on the package one more time. Cock Nest Monster. He knew the branding was meant to be ridiculous, but there's something about it that raised red flags in his mind. It was almost sinister. He needed an edge tonight, though. He couldn't afford to disappoint, not after the promises that he'd made to Melody about his sexual prowess. He'd never be able to look himself in the mirror again if he messed this up. Blake tore into the cardboard box with his teeth. It took him a few tries, but eventually, after ripping the packaging to shreds, he managed to get to the goods. He poured the pills into his palm and stared at them. How many was he supposed to take? The box had been torn to ribbons by now. He'd need to puzzle the pieces back together if he wanted to read what it said. He didn't have time for that. The last thing he wanted was to get caught popping them. This chick was about to get the screwing of her life. He couldn't have her thinking that he needed PEDs to make it happen. He heard the sound of feet shuffling around in the bathroom. She'd be coming out any second. Now or never. Blake shoved the handful into his mouth, swallowed them down, then stuffed what was left of the packaging back into his jeans. The bathroom door opened, and facing him was the essence of erotic bliss. Melody was wearing a black lingerie set with a matching sheer robe. It was open, exposing her tight, flat stomach and large breasts, which were just barely covered by an elegant lace bra. Danny never had a body like that, even when they were in college. This might be the pinnacle of his sexual achievements. She slinked up to him and kissed him deep. God, she felt good. Something in his pants began to stir. He guessed that meant the dick pills were working. Blake fumbled with her bra strap like a virgin until finally unhooking it. When he got it off, he admired her beautiful shaped breasts. They hung impossibly from her chest, defying gravity in a way that only a young woman's breasts could. And once again, he was reminded why he'd been putting up with the daddy nonsense. After her foreplay, she moved her head down to his crotch. "Oh, Daddy," she said, "you didn't tell me you were so gifted down here." Daddy. There was that word again. He pushed past it and tried to think of something to say. "Why don't you let me gift it to you, baby?" Not his smoothest line, but she didn't seem to mind. Melody licked her lips, then helped him out of his pants. "Yeah, babe, put your mouth on me." He cringed at that. Is that the best he could do? Put your mouth on me? Clearly, he needed to practice his dirty talk, but his embarrassment melted away seconds later when he felt the warm embrace of her lips around his manhood, the velvety softness of her tongue against his shaft, and the rhythmic bobbing of her head moving up and down on his lap. She began to gag. "That's right," he moaned. "Choke on it." Was that something he should say? He had heard it in pornos, but he wondered if it was rude. Oh well. She hadn't said anything. In fact, she was still gagging. "Hey," said Blake, "you don't have to go so hard. We have a long night ahead of us." There was no answer, just more gagging. "Babe?" Blake said again, only this time the confidence in his voice was gone. He opened his eyes to see Melody flailing her arms. She balled her hands up into fists and began to beat on his thighs. "Ah, stop that!" He tried to pull himself free, but realized that his member was stuck firmly in her throat. Melody's face was turning purple now. Snot bubbled from her nose, veins popped from her temples. He could feel an intense swelling in his privates, which made no sense. He was fairly certain he was no longer aroused. Blake stood up and pushed hard against her forehead, but couldn't get anything to budge. I'm stuck!" he screamed. He leveraged himself against the foot of the bed and began pulling her hair in a desperate attempt to get free, but no matter how hard he tugged, there was no brute forcing himself out of her mouth. She was scratching at his thighs with her fingernails now, leaving deep red gashes down his legs. "That really hurts!" he shouted. Her choking grew louder, her attempts to separate herself more frantic, but despite their best efforts, Blake's dick was wedged in too tight to remove. And then The choking stopped. Melody's body went slack. For an eerie moment, the bedroom was filled with silence as Blake stood petrified, the girl's face still attached to his crotch. "Hello?" he said, hoping she'd somehow wake up and answer him. He'd have given anything in that moment for Melody to shoot him a thumbs up or a reassuring wink. Hell, even a muffled, "Oh, I'm fine," would have sufficed, so long as it disrupted the eerie stillness that had settled over the room. What he got instead was a hideous pop. The sound jarring him from his stupor and bouncing off the walls, rebounding back and forth between his ears as if to tease him about the hell he was about to experience. This was followed by an awful cracking and splintering so loud that if he didn't know better, he would have thought a tree was falling inside of the bedroom. Sloppy, wet squelches poured into the room next. It was only after hearing this that he understood the sinful burble now haunting him was none other than the sound of flesh shifting, tearing, and rearranging inside of Melody's head. He gawked down at her, confused about what was going on. His mind filled with questions he was sure he didn't want to know the answer to. Those answers would be coming very soon, though. Whether he liked it or not, those answers would be coming very, very soon. It burst through the back of her head. A grotesque pink nightmare, its long, lean body slick and glistening, lined with thick, purple veins and dripping with brain muck. The thing had the eyes of a snake, and its freakishly bulbous, helmet-shaped head had bony spikes fanning out from the top of it in a way that almost resembled a crown. It wriggled side to side like a cobra performing a dance, splattering the room with blood as it slithered even further out of the back of Melody's skull. It drew its lips back, revealing sharp, jagged teeth jutting out from a set of deep, black gums. And then it let out an awful screech. Its voice shredded the air like it was made out of broken glass, and when it pierced Blake's ears, he let out a scream of his own. He realized shortly after, doing so had been a terrible mistake. Now the creature's attention had turned to him. It studied Blake with its yellow eyes, then grinned a predator's grin. Terror swept over him. The veins running up and down the creature's body seemed to pulse with anticipation. It opened its mouth wide, and a long forked tongue sprung out, licked some brain that had been stuck to its eye, and then returned back to where it came. Blake couldn't stand to look at it anymore, so he glanced back down to Melody. She was long gone, of course. Her eyes had rolled back in their sockets, and blood was seeping from every orifice in her face. It was just Blake now, stuck in a room with whatever this thing was, gnashing its teeth at him. This demonic snake, this worm from hell. He didn't know what he was dealing with, but just looking at it made him want to empty his bowels. The only thing he did know was that he needed to get away from it. Once more he shoved Melody's face from his crotch, and to his surprise, this time he found some space. At least one thing was going right. He sprinted for the door, no need to stop and put on pants. This thing wasn't going to wait for him to get decent. No, he needed to create some distance between it and himself right away. Find some help, a cop maybe, or hell, anyone with a gun. He only made it a step or two before his leg snagged something and he went tumbling face down onto the carpet. He groaned and rolled onto his back, only to find the creature was already upon him. It was relentless. It lunged forward, jagged teeth snapping, shut only inches from his face before Blake managed to grab its neck and prevent it from biting him. He tried to get to his feet, but it had coiled itself around his body and began to squeeze him tight. Air was seeping from his lungs, and he could feel his ribs bending under the pressure. He wasn't ready to die. Not on that bedroom floor of some woman he'd just met. Well, especially while he wasn't wearing pants. A survival instinct he didn't know had kicked in, and he rolled onto his stomach. He decided to let his reflexes take over as his arms and legs kicked and thrashed until he had room to get up. He was standing finally, but getting himself untangled from the creature was proving to be difficult. He was still holding it by the neck when it lunged at his face again. This time it nearly caught his nose. That was a close one. If it had been any closer, it would have bitten it clean off. His eyes were drawn to the bathroom door, and he thought he might be able to lock himself in there and wait for help to arrive. In order to do that, he'd need to force this thing off of him, one way or another. Blake tightened his grip around the creature's throat and let out a primal scream as he rushed the door as hard as he could, using its head as a battering ram. His body collided with the heavy wood, sounding like a gunshot had gone off. A horrible pain pulsed through his privates, waves of agony pouring over him. He must have caught himself on something during his tumble. He lay on the cool ceramic tile of the bathroom floor for a second, catching his breath. Whatever damage he'd done to himself, he'd also dished out to the worm thing because it no longer had a hold of him. He sat up slowly and saw the creature sprawled out on the floor. How big was this thing? Its body stretched all across the bathroom. He stared at its face, and a ridiculous thought popped into his head. It looked kind of like it. There'd be no time to finish that thought, because a second later its eyes snapped open and its body began to stir. "No, you don't," Blake said. It coiled up and sprung towards Blake again, but this time he was ready. He caught it once more in midair, grasping just beneath its helmet-shaped head, then pinned it to the ground. He needed to figure out how to put this thing down for good. Blunt force trauma worked before. Hadn't responded well to being slammed through the door, but he figured he'd go for a less suicidal approach this time. Blake cocked his fist back and punched it as hard as he could right between the eyes. Throbs of pain rolled through him and he almost collapsed onto the floor. The hell was that? The pain had left him confused, but the good news was the creature seemed to be hurting. Worse than he was. It was woozy. He had it on the ropes. His eyes found the toilet, and a devious idea crossed his mind. This time he'd go in for the kill. Blake lifted the toilet seat and pinned the creature's head to the edge of the bowl. "Die, you ugly bastard!" He slammed the toilet seat onto the creature's head. Another wave of pain shot through him, and he doubled over. This one he could feel in his stomach even, but the adrenaline pumping through his body refused to let him stop. He slammed the seat again, screaming both in rage and in agony, then did it a third and a fourth time. After a half-dozen attempts, the ceramic seat was smashed to pieces. But it had done its job. The creature was out, its body limp, its face dangling into the toilet bowl. Blake fell back, panting. He finally had time to think. What the hell was that thing? It just popped out of Melody's head like some sort of brain-sucking alien from a cheesy horror movie. How had something so large been inside of her? Was it a parasite? His eyes followed the body again, curious about how something so big could take root inside of a human. It was mind-boggling how massive it was. The longer he looked, the more he began to think its body would never end. The end would come, though. And when he found its tail, he let out a scream so shrill he could have cracked the bathroom mirror. His head started spinning. The creature's tail ended exactly where his dick started.
Hey, did you like part 1 of Gas Station Dick Pills? If so, hell yeah. If not, I don't know, go f*** yourself. I'm Vincent V. Cava, author of Gas Station Dick Pills, and a few other crappy stories that you may or may not be aware of if you've been listening to this channel for a while. But today I want to talk to you about a brand new horror book series written by this mother and my good friend, James Sabas Baby.
You in the comments complaining. I see you, motherfucker. I get it, it's an ad. But ads are inevitable and they cannot be defeated. I just want to sell you in exchange for your entertainment so I can buy my third Lamborghini. Midnight Monster Madness is a new creature double feature pulp horror book series. And we're bringing you a new one every month for the low price of... Oh shit, that Lamborghini is gonna have to wait. It's Goosebumps for grown-ups. It's Creepshow in prose. Each book features 2 creepy stories written by James and myself. Book 1, we brought you Hair of the Dog and the Thing in the Sink. Book 2, we brought you Outrun the Reaper and Power Play. And you've already got a taste of Book 3, and I know you're ready for it because it's coming at you
faster than Sonic the Hedgehog when there's a sale on chili dogs.
Alice off of Diddy. So utter chaos. gas station dick pills. I got a boner for this one, baby. Let's go! One story's about nature's cutest little murder monster. The other story's about otters. So check out Midnight Monster Madness. Only available on Amazon. Get it today! I don't know how to end this. Oh, fuck.